Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content and want to help the channel grow, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps us more than you could possibly know, and allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the mysteries that keep us all awake at night. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It's incredible to know we have listeners from every corner of the globe. Now, let's get into it. MK Ultra. The File. They never meant to find. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of grey Boston day when the sky pressed down like a wet blanket, and the smell of rain mixed with rotting leaves filled the air. Investigative journalist Eli Jones lived in a converted brownstone in Boston's South End 3rd floor, the kind of place where the radiators clanked all winter and the floorboards creaked with every step. His neighbours were the usual urban mix, a couple of grad students below him, a retired teacher across the hall who played opera too loud on Sunday mornings, and a rotating cast of young professionals who never stayed longer than their lease required. People kept to themselves here. That was the unspoken rule. You didn't ask questions. You didn't get involved. That morning, Eli had been up since 5, working on a piece about defence contractor fraud. 3 cups of coffee deep and running on maybe 4 hours of sleep. At 42, he'd been doing this long enough to know that the best stories came from the documents nobody wanted you to see. The sources who called from payphones. The patterns that emerged when you stared at spreadsheets until your eyes burned. He'd built a reputation over 2 decades. The guy who didn't let go, the journalist who'd spent 6 months tracking down a single witness for a story about police corruption, who'd gone through 10,000 pages of court documents to expose a judge taking bribes, who'd lost a marriage and 2 jobs because he couldn't walk away from a lead, even when every rational part of his brain told him to. His ex-wife Jennifer used to say he had a compulsion. You don't investigate stories, Eli. You disappear into them. She'd left 5 years ago. He couldn't blame her. The knock came at 7:15, but when he opened the door, no one was there. Just a package on the doormat, wrapped in brown paper that felt old and soft like it had been handled many times before being delivered to him. No stamps, no postage mark, no return address. Just his name written in careful block letters across the wrapping, the ink slightly faded as if it had been sitting somewhere for a while before making its way to his door. Inside his apartment, with the morning light struggling through grimy windows, he unwrapped it slowly. Years of journalistic instinct made him careful with potential evidence. He photographed the package from multiple angles before opening it. Inside he found 2 items. The first was a storage unit key, brass and worn smooth with age, with a number stamped into the metal, 39. The kind of key that had been copied and used countless times, the grooves worn just slightly out of spec. The second was an index card, yellowed with age, the edges soft and curled like old book pages. Typewritten across its face were 2 lines in a font that screamed mid-20th century. That distinctive, slightly uneven pressure of manual typewriter keys. Storage Unit 39, Cambridge. You don't know the truth yet. And below that, a signature in fading blue ink that made his stomach drop. Sidney Gottlieb. Eli stood in his kitchen for a full 5 minutes, holding the card up to the light, turning it over in his hands, looking for any sign that this was a prank or a setup, or some elaborate piece of performance art. Sidney Gottlieb was real. More than real. He was infamous among the small community of journalists and historians who studied the darker corners of Cold War intelligence operations. The chemist with a club foot who'd run the CIA's MK Ultra program. The man who'd authorized experiments that destroyed lives, shattered minds, left a trail of suicide and madness in the name of national security. The man who died in early 2002 in some small house in Virginia, having spent his final years tending goats and denying nothing because, as he'd said in one of his rare interviews, he'd done what he believed was necessary at the time. 20 years dead. So how did someone sign his name on this card? Eli made another pot of coffee. He called in sick to the magazine he was freelancing for. He spent 2 hours searching online for any recent mention of Sidney Gottlieb, any conspiracy theories about faked deaths or secret programs, anything that might explain what he was holding. Nothing. At noon, he grabbed his coat and headed for Cambridge. The storage facility sat off Massachusetts Avenue, tucked between a Korean restaurant that advertised authentic home-style cooking and an auto body shop where 3 men in coveralls stood around smoking cigarettes and ignoring a car with its hood up. The storage place was called Secure Space, which seemed almost comically bland. A 3-story concrete building painted industrial beige with a logo that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s. The front office smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. A woman in her 50s sat behind a desk reading a thriller novel with a lurid cover, a portable heater running at her feet despite the office being uncomfortably warm. Eli showed her the key. She barely looked up from her book. Unit 39 is in the back corner, 2nd floor, elevator's broken, so you'll have to take the stairs. How long has this unit been rented? Now she looked at him, her expression shifting from bored to mildly suspicious. Why? Just curious. I inherited some things from a relative. She turned to her computer, clicked around for a moment. Since 1998. Paid through the end of next year. Automatic bank transfer every December. 24 years. Someone had been paying for this storage unit for nearly a quarter century. The name on the account? Eli asked. Can't give out that information. Privacy policy. He nodded, thanked her, and headed inside. The air inside the facility was stale and cold, with that particular smell of concrete and metal, and things left undisturbed for too long. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, half of them flickering in a way that made the hallways feel unstable, like the building itself was uncertain about remaining solid. Eli's footsteps echoed on the concrete stairs as he climbed to the 2nd level. The stairwell was painted institutional green, the walls marked with scuffs and scratches from decades of people moving furniture and boxes, living their lives in transitions and storage. The hallway on the 2nd floor stretched ahead, dimly lit by those same flickering fluorescents. Unit numbers were stencilled on rolling metal doors, 28, 30, 32, continuing down into the deeper part of the building where the natural light from the front windows couldn't reach. Unit 39 was at the very end, tucked into a corner where the hallway dead-ended. The padlock was heavy-duty, the kind made to resist bolt cutters, but the brass keys slid in smoothly and turned without resistance. The door rolled up with a metallic screech that made him wince. Inside was darkness. He felt along the wall until he found a pull chain for an overhead bulb. The light came on weak and yellow, barely illuminating the space. 10 by 10 feet. Cardboard boxes stacked floor to ceiling along 3 walls. File folders, binders, old reel-to-reel tape cases in faded cardboard boxes, a dented filing cabinet in the corner, its drawers slightly ajar as if someone had left in a hurry and hadn't bothered to close them completely. The smell was overwhelming. Old paper, dust, the faint chemical scent of decaying film and magnetic tape. And in the centre of it all, sitting on top of a cardboard box like it had been placed there deliberately, staged for him to find, was a manila folder with a single label typed on a piece of paper that had been taped to the front. Sub-Project 708. Eli's hands were shaking as he picked it up. The folder was thick, maybe 2 inches of documents, the edges of the papers inside stained and brittle with age. He opened it, and the world he thought he understood began to unravel. The program they admitted to. To understand what Eli found that day, sitting on the concrete floor of a storage unit while afternoon shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped, you first have to understand what the government already confessed to. Not willingly, never willingly. MK Ultra was born in April of 1953, during the height of Cold War paranoia, when every Soviet advance seemed like an existential threat, and every intelligence gap felt like a potential catastrophe waiting to happen. CIA Director Alan Dulles authorized the program, but it was Sidney Gottlieb who ran it, a chemist with a brilliant mind, a pronounced limp from childhood polio, and a belief that the human mind could be broken down and rebuilt like any other machine. The program's stated purpose was simple: develop mind control techniques that could counter Soviet brainwashing methods. American soldiers had come back from Korean prison camps saying things they shouldn't say, confessing to war crimes that hadn't happened, parroting communist propaganda like they'd been programmed. The agency was terrified that the Soviets had discovered some technique, some method of breaking human will and rebuilding it, and that America was falling behind in yet another arms race, this one taking place inside the human skull. But fear doesn't excuse what happened next. Under Gottlieb's direction, the CIA conducted experiments on thousands of unwitting subjects. They dosed them with LSD without consent, sometimes for days or weeks at a time. They subjected them to electroshock therapy calibrated to erase memories. They locked them in sensory deprivation tanks until their sense of self began to dissolve. They deprived them of sleep until hallucinations became indistinguishable from reality. They used psychological torture disguised as research, breaking minds in the name of protecting democracy. They funded experiments at universities, hospitals and prisons, using sub-projects that numbered in the hundreds, each one exploring a different aspect of human consciousness and control. Each one documented with clinical precision, at least initially, before someone decided that maybe keeping detailed records of illegal human experimentation wasn't such a good idea. Some of these experiments took place at Stanford Research Institute, where volunteers thought they were participating in psychological studies and instead had their perception of reality systematically dismantled. Others at McGill University in Montreal, where a psychiatrist named Ewan Cameron developed something he called psychic driving, playing recorded messages to patients for weeks on end, sometimes while they were kept in drug-induced comas, until their personalities fragmented and reformed around whatever message was being drilled into their unconscious minds. The Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, dosed prisoners with LSD for 77 consecutive days. 77 days of chemically induced psychological breakdown, and the prisoners were offered reduced sentences or extra privileges for participating, as if there was any real consent involved when the alternative was more years behind bars. Boston Psychopathic Hospital participated, so did dozens of other institutions, prestigious universities and respected medical facilities, lending their names and facilities to experiments that would later be recognised as torture. They documented some of it, not all of it, not even most of it, and then, in 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the files destroyed. Helms claims he did it to protect operational security, to keep sensitive intelligence methods out of enemy hands. Critics say he did it to protect himself and everyone else who'd authorised or conducted these experiments, to destroy evidence before congressional investigators could start asking uncomfortable questions about what exactly the agency had been doing with taxpayer money and human subjects. Either way, thousands of pages went into the incinerator, documents describing experiments, results, methodologies, subject names, all of it reduced to ash and smoke. But not everything burned. Some files survived because they were misfiled, stuck in the wrong drawer or under the wrong classification code when the destruction order came down. Others survived because someone decided they were worth keeping, someone who understood that history had a way of catching up with secrets. And some, like Subproject 708, survived because they were never officially part of the program to begin with. The file ELE found. Subproject 708 was not listed in any declassified CIA document. It did not appear in the Church Committee hearings of 1975, when Congress finally forced the agency to admit what it had done, and the nation learned that their government had been conducting mind control experiments on its own citizens. It was not mentioned in the presidential apology that followed. It was not mentioned in any of the lawsuits filed by victims or their families. It was not mentioned in any of the historical retrospectives, the academic papers, the investigative journalism pieces that had been written about MKUltra in the decades since. According to the official record, Subproject 708 never existed, but Eli was holding proof that it did. The binder he opened that first afternoon in the storage unit contained case files for 12 subjects, coded by number and constellation name. Aries 1 through Pisces 12. Each file included behavioural charts, psychological evaluations, handwritten notes from observers, and photographs, mostly children, ranging in age from 6 to 14 years old. The photographs were what made him feel sick. Black and white, slightly grainy, clinical in composition. Children standing against height-marked walls like they were being booked for crimes. Children sitting in chairs, electrodes attached to their scalps, their faces blank and passive. Children in what looked like hospital beds, restraints visible at the edges of the frame. Their eyes were what got to him. Not frightened, not angry, just empty. The kind of emptiness that comes from having given up, from having learned that resistance is pointless, from having been broken down so thoroughly that compliance becomes the only available survival strategy. One girl, maybe 8 years old, identified as Libra 3. She had dark hair cut short, like someone had done it without much care for how it looked. In the photo, she stared directly at the camera with an expression that was somehow worse than sadness. It was absence, like whoever she'd been before was already gone. The dates range from 1961 to 1963. The locations rotated between 3 primary sites: Fort Detrick in Maryland, a facility in rural Vermont that was only identified by a site number, and a private residence in upstate New York listed simply as Site Amber. Fort Detrick was real. Eli knew that much. The Army's Biological Warfare Center during the Cold War, the place where anthrax and botulism and God knows what else were weaponized. It was also, according to declassified documents, one of the testing sites for certain MKUltra experiments, though the details remained classified. But nothing in the public record mentioned children, nothing mentioned Project Constellation, and nothing mentioned what Eli found next, buried in the middle of the binder, a sub-file labelled Acquisition Protocol. The pages inside described in bureaucratic language that tried to make atrocity sound like policy, how the program obtained its subjects. They weren't volunteers, they weren't the adult prisoners or college students who'd participated in other MKUltra experiments. They were children removed from a government-run foster program in Massachusetts. The intake forms were meticulous: name, age, date of birth, case number from the foster system, medical history, psychological evaluation, and then a section marked Suitability Assessment, where someone had made notes in cramped handwriting. Subject displays appropriate vulnerability markers, limited family connections, history of institutional care, unlikely to be missed. 3 children were documented in detail. The forms listed their names, though those names had been partially redacted in some kind of after-the-fact attempt at privacy protection that seemed almost obscene given what had been done to them. All 3 were described as psychologically vulnerable and suitable for extended observation. All 3 were later reported to authorities as runaways from the foster system. No investigations were conducted, no follow-up reports were filed. The caseworkers noted that runaways from foster care were common, that the children had been troubled and difficult to place, that their disappearance, while unfortunate, was not entirely unexpected. The case numbers in the foster system matched perfectly with 3 of the Constellation subject files: Aries 7, Libra 3, Capricorn 9. Someone had taken these children from a system that was supposed to protect them. Someone had erased their existence from official records. And someone had subjected them to experiments that the rest of MKUltra's victims, horrific as their experiences were, had never endured. Because the other MKUltra subjects eventually went home, eventually were released. Eventually, decades later, some of them learned what had been done to them and were able to speak about it, to seek compensation, to tell their stories. These children never got that chance. Eli sat on the cold concrete floor of that storage unit for 2 hours, reading through file after file, his journalist training trying to maintain objectivity, while another part of him wanted to burn every page so he wouldn't have to know that this had happened in his country, in his state, in his lifetime. But he didn't burn anything. He took photographs of every page. He loaded boxes into his car, making 3 trips up and down those concrete stairs while the afternoon faded into evening and the security lights in the parking lot flickered on. And then, in the last box he opened, he found the tapes. The recordings. The tapes were stored carefully, each reel to reel in its own cardboard case, stacked in a box with padding to protect them from damage. Someone had cared for these recordings, had wanted them to survive. The cases were labelled in that same careful typewriter font. Session L13, Adaptive Response Test, Constellation Initiation, Phase 3, Observation Only. There were 23 tapes in total. Eli hadn't owned a reel-to-reel player since college, back when he'd been a film studies major before switching to journalism, back when he'd spent late nights in editing bays, transferring old films and learning to love the texture of analogue media. But he knew someone who did. Marcus Webb ran a small audio restoration business out of his basement in Somerville, one of those side hustles that had somehow become a full-time career. He specialised in digitising old recordings for historical societies, documentary filmmakers, and amateur genealogists who wanted to preserve their grandparents' voices before the tapes degraded beyond recovery. Eli had done Marcus a favour 2 years back. A story about a crooked landlord who was trying to evict Marcus and 20 other tenants to convert their building into luxury condos. Eli's article had brought enough public attention that the landlord backed down and sold to a non-profit housing trust instead. Marcus answered on the second ring. "Eli, it's been a minute. What's going on?" "I need a favour. I've got some old reel-to-reel tapes that need to be digitised. Can I bring them by tonight?" "Tonight? Man, I've got a date at 8. Cancel it. This is important. I'll owe you." A pause. Marcus knew Eli well enough to understand that important meant something serious. How important are we talking? Potentially career-defining, potentially dangerous, definitely something you'll want to be able to say you were, part of when this all comes out. Another pause, longer this time, then, "Come over, but you're buying me dinner while we work." Marcus's basement was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd turned nostalgia into a business model. Walls lined with vintage audio equipment, shelves full of carefully labelled tapes and records, a work table covered in wires and splicing equipment, and movie posters from the 70s covering every available wall space. Marcus himself was 35, rail-thin, with a beard he'd been growing since graduate school, and a collection of band t-shirts that seemed to only include groups that had broken up before he was born. He cleared space on the work table while Eli unpacked the first tape. "How old are these?" Marcus asked, examining the case. 60 years, give or take." Marcus whistled low. "These should have degraded by now. Magnetic tape doesn't last forever, especially not in random storage conditions. Someone took really good care of them." "Can you tell anything else about them?" Marcus held the case up to the light, squinting. "Professional quality recording based on the tape brand. This isn't consumer-grade stuff. This is what you'd use in a radio studio or a research lab. And the storage method..." He tapped the cardboard. "This padding, the way they're organised. Someone knew what they were doing. Someone wanted these to last." He threaded the first tape onto his machine with practiced efficiency, adjusting tension and speed. The machine was a beautiful restored Revox, all chrome and switches, the kind of equipment that had cost a fortune in its day and was now kept alive by enthusiasts like Marcus, who understood that some technologies were worth preserving. "Ready?" Eli nodded. Marcus pressed play, static, the hiss of empty tape running for a few seconds. Then a voice, male, calm and professional, speaking with the kind of measured authority that suggested medical training or military experience. "Session L13, subject Aries 7, date October 12, 1962. Hypnotic induction, standard protocol. Subject has been prepared according to Phase 1 guidelines, proceeding with conditioning sequence." What followed was a hypnosis session. The voice guided the subject. Based on the breathing sounds, a child through a series of relaxation exercises. The tone was soothing, almost paternal, which made it somehow worse. "You're feeling very relaxed now. Your arms are heavy. Your legs are heavy. You're safe here. You're comfortable. Nothing can hurt you when you listen to my voice." The breathing on the tape slowed, deepened. "Good. Very good. Now we're going to talk about special words. These words are just for you. When you hear these words, they mean something special. Can you listen carefully?" A small voice, barely audible. "Yes. Good. The first word is constellation. When you hear the word constellation, you'll feel calm and safe, just like you feel right now. Say it with me. Constellation. Perfect. The second word is anchor. When you hear the word anchor, you'll stop what you're doing and wait for instructions. Say it. Anchor. Excellent. Now we're going to practice. I'm going to count backwards from 5, and when I reach 1, you'll wake up. But you won't remember this session. You won't remember my voice or these words. They'll be buried deep inside, waiting. When you hear them again, you'll know what to do without knowing why. Do you understand? I understand. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. A pause. Then the child's voice again, confused. Where am I? You're in the testing room. We were just talking about your drawings. Do you remember? Yes, the drawings. Good. Why don't you go rest now? We'll continue tomorrow. The tape ended. Eli and Marcus sat in silence for a long moment. What the fuck was that? Marcus finally said. Evidence of something that was never supposed to see the light of day. That was a kid. That voice was a kid. I know. Someone did that to a kid. Someone trained them like a dog, like a machine. I know. Marcus stood up, paced to the other side of the basement and back. We need to call someone, FBI, Justice Department, someone. Not yet. I need to hear the rest first. I need to understand what we're dealing with before we go public. The second tape was worse. This one was labelled Adaptive Response Test, dated February 1963. The recording quality was poorer, as if it had been made in a different location, or with different equipment. There was background noise, footsteps, a door closing, the hum of machinery. The same male voice from before. Subject 7, please state your designation. A young girl's voice, flat and emotionless. Aries 7. What is your number? 7. What is your constellation? Aries. Very good. We're going to do some exercises now. When you hear the tone, I want you to stand up and face the wall. Let's practice. A high-pitched tone, maybe 2 seconds long, shuffling sounds, footsteps. Good. Sit back down. More shuffling. Now we're going to try something new. When you hear 2 short tones, you'll count backwards from 20. Begin when you hear the signal. 2 short tones. The girl's voice still flat. 20, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Excellent. How do you feel? I feel nothing. A pause. Then a different voice, also male but older, speaking to someone off microphone. Response time is improving. Memory suppression is holding. She's ready. Phase 2 begins next week. We'll move her to Site Amber and start the memory integration trials. The first voice again. Subject 7, you may rest now. Remember, when you leave this room, you won't recall anything we discussed. You'll remember only that you had a nice conversation with the counsellor. I understand. The tape clicked off. Marcus had his head in his hands. Memory integration trials. What does that even mean? I don't know, but I think we're going to find out. They listened to 5 more tapes that night. Each one was worse than the last. Children being conditioned to respond to specific words, tones, even visual cues. Children describing dissociative states in clinical detail. Children who spoke in monotones about their own conditioning like they were observing it from outside their bodies. And through it all, that calm male voice, never angry, never impatient, treating the systematic destruction of young minds like it was just another job to be done well. It was after midnight when they reached the tape labelled with red ink, "Do not file, destroy after playback." The recording was short, less than 3 minutes. A single voice. Male, whispering urgently like he was afraid of being overheard. If this ever gets out, it ends the agency, not just the program, the whole thing. Congress will tear us apart. Helms knows it. Dulles knew it. That's why we moved everything off the official logs. That's why 708 doesn't exist on paper. Static crackled. Then quieter. We're using techniques that go beyond anything authorised. The dissociation protocols, the long-term conditioning, the memory compartmentalisation. This isn't research anymore. We're creating something that's never existed before. And the subjects? Christ, the subjects are children. If the press gets wind of this, if the families figure it out, if even one of those kids remembers what we did, more static. Gottlieb wants to shut it down. He's worried we've gone too far, that we're creating something we can't control, but the results are undeniable. We've achieved sustained behavioural modification in 87% of subjects. Long-term memory suppression in 93%. If we can replicate this at scale, if we can refine the protocols... The tape cut off abruptly, like someone had physically stopped the recording. Eli checked the case. Someone had written a date in pencil on the spine. August 1963. That date was significant. In August of 1963, CIA Director John McCone had ordered that certain MKUltra files be moved off official logs and stored separately. It was part of a broader effort to compartmentalise the program, to create plausible deniability if anything ever came to light. Subproject 7, 08 it seemed, had been so sensitive that it was compartmentalised even within that compartmentalised system. "We should stop," Marcus said. His face was pale and he'd stopped making eye contact with Eli halfway through the last tape. "We should call someone now. There are 18 more tapes. I don't want to hear them. I know, but I need to. I need to understand the full scope before I write this story. This isn't a story, Eli. This is... I don't even know what this is. Evidence of crimes against humanity? A smoking gun? What are you supposed to do with something like this? Expose it. Make sure everyone knows what was done. Make sure it can never happen again." Marcus laughed, but there was no humour in it. "You really think it's not still happening? You think this was unique? Programs like this don't just stop." Eli didn't have an answer for that. They called it a night at 2 a.m. Marcus made copies of everything they'd digitised so far, storing them on multiple hard drives with redundant backups. Years of working with historical preservation had made him paranoid about data loss. "If anything happens to you," Marcus said as Eli was leaving, "I'm going to the press with all of this. I'm going to every newspaper, every TV station, every website that will listen. Nothing's going to happen to me. Promise me anyway. I promise." Eli drove home through empty streets, the boxes of tapes and documents secured in his trunk. Boston at 2 a.m. was a different city. Quiet, almost peaceful. The kind of place where you could believe that terrible things weren't happening just beneath the surface of normal life. But he knew better now. He'd heard the tapes, he'd seen the photographs, and he was beginning to understand that some truths, once learned, couldn't be unlearned. The intersection. Over the next week, Eli barely slept. He dove deeper into the files, cross-referencing names and dates with everything he could find in the public record. His apartment became a command centre, walls covered with photocopies and printouts, timelines mapped out on poster boards, connections drawn with red string like something out of a conspiracy thriller. Except this wasn't fiction. This was real. He reached out to former CIA officers, the few who'd broken ranks over the years and were willing to talk about what they'd seen. He contacted historians who specialised in Cold War intelligence operations. He tracked down activists who'd spent decades fighting for MKUltra victims, trying to get them compensation and recognition for what had been done to them. One name kept coming up: Victor Marchetti. Marchetti was a former CIA officer who'd worked in the agency during the 60s and early 70s, rising to the position of executive assistant to the deputy director. In 1974, he'd broken ranks and published The CIA and the Cult of Intelligence, one of the first books to expose agency operations to public scrutiny. The agency had tried to stop publication, marking more than 300 passages for deletion under national security laws. Marchetti fought them in court and won, though the published version still had deletion marks throughout, showing readers exactly what the government didn't want them to know. In the years since, he'd become something of an elder statesman in the intelligence whistleblower community, respected by some, reviled by others, always willing to talk about the things he'd seen that still bothered him decades later. Eli found him living in Virginia, outside Richmond, in a modest house with a garden that suggested retirement had been treating him well. He was 88 now, but his voice on the phone was strong and clear. "An investigative journalist wants to talk about old CIA programs," Marchetti said when Eli called. "Let me guess, you found something. Something that wasn't in the public releases." "How did you know?" "Because I'm still alive. If you were just rehashing the official story, you wouldn't need to talk to me. The fact that you're calling means you've got something new, something they still care about keeping buried." They spoke on the phone for 2 hours that first time. Eli didn't reveal everything. He'd learned long ago to protect his sources and methods, but he sketched out enough for Marchetti to understand what he was dealing with. "Subproject 708, Marchetti repeated when Eli mentioned the number. "Never heard it. But that doesn't mean it didn't exist. There were programs within programs, operations that only a handful of people knew about. If you're telling me they were running conditioning experiments on children, I believe you. I saw enough to know that nothing was off the table." "Did you ever hear about something called Project Constellation?" Eli asked. A long pause. In the background, Eli could hear birds singing. A peaceful retirement afternoon in Virginia, except they were discussing child abuse and psychological torture. "No," Marchetti finally said. "But there were rumours. This would have been late 60s, maybe early 70s. I heard whispers about a long-term program, something that involved subjects who were monitored for years after the initial conditioning. The idea was to see if the effects persisted, if they could be reactivated later. I never saw documentation. No one who talked about it would admit to knowing details, but people talked." "Who ran it?" "Had to be Gottlieb's people. He was the only one with the authority and the institutional protection to pull something like that off. Dulles protected him. Helms protected him. Even McCone, who supposedly cleaned house when he took over, let Gottlieb keep running his experiments. Why? Because it worked. Because whatever objections anyone had about ethics or legality, the results were compelling enough that people looked the other way. That's how these things always go. The ends justify the means until suddenly they don't, and by then it's too late." After the call ended, Eli sat in his apartment and stared at the files spread across his floor. He thought about the children in those photographs, thought about what had happened to them after the program supposedly ended, thought about whether anyone had ever checked to see if they were okay, if they'd survived, if they'd been able to build anything resembling normal lives. He went back to the files and started looking for outcomes. Most of the Constellation subject files ended in 1963 or 1964, with final notations like subject transferred or observation concluded. No details about where they were transferred to or what observation concluded actually meant. But one file was different. Ares 7. The file for Ares 7 continued beyond 1964. There were periodic check-ins, psychological evaluations conducted under false pretenses, incident reports that suggested someone had been monitoring the subject into adulthood. The check-ins happened every few years. 1968, 1972, 1981, 1989. Each one documenting the subject's location, employment status, relationships, mental health. Like the program had never really ended. It had just gone dormant, watching and waiting. The last entry was dated April 1997. It described a violent episode in a small town in New Hampshire. Ares 7, now an adult living under their original name, had experienced what local newspapers described as a psychotic break. The incident involved a confrontation at a grocery store, erratic behaviour, claims of hearing voices giving specific instructions. Police were called. The subject was hospitalised for 3 days, then released. The official diagnosis was brief psychotic disorder, stress-induced. Medication was prescribed, follow-up care was recommended, and that would have been the end of it. Just another sad case of mental illness in small-town America, except for what Eli found attached to the hospital report. A handwritten note on CIA letterhead, dated 1 week after the incident. Trigger phrase confirmed effective after 34 years. Subject responded to auditory cue exactly as predicted. Memory suppression protocols remain intact. Subject has no conscious recall of program participation. Recommend continued observation. Long-term viability of conditioning confirmed. Eli read it 3 times, his hand shaking. They had reactivated the conditioning. More than 3 decades after the program supposedly ended, someone had tracked down Ares 7, now a middle-aged adult trying to live a normal life, and had deliberately triggered the psychological programming that had been implanted when they were a child, just to see if it still worked. It did. And someone had documented the results like it was a successful experiment, rather than evidence of ongoing psychological torture. Eli stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the Boston street below. Normal people living normal lives, going to work, getting coffee, complaining about the weather, having no idea what their government had done was perhaps still doing to its own citizens. He thought about going public immediately, calling every journalist he knew, uploading the documents to every whistleblower site he could find, making sure this couldn't be buried again. But his training told him to wait, to build the case properly, to understand the full scope before making any moves. He went back to the files and kept digging. The knock on the door, 3 days after Eli started organising the files into a coherent narrative for publication, someone knocked on his door. It was 4 in the afternoon, one of those late November days when dusk comes early and the light takes on a bruised quality, yellow and grey at the same time. Eli had been working for 10 straight hours, surviving on coffee and crackers, lost in the details of case files and cross-reference timelines. The knock was firm, official. The kind of knock that comes from someone who expects the door to be opened. Eli looked through the peephole. 2 men in dark suits stood on his stoop, hands clasped in front of them, expressions neutral. They had that particular quality that screamed federal employee. Too well-groomed, too bland, too deliberately unremarkable. He opened the door but left the chain on. "Can I help you?" The taller of the 2 men smiled. It was the kind of smile you practice in a mirror, calculated to seem friendly while conveying no actual warmth. "Mr. Mercer, we're with a federal contracting firm that handles record preservation for various government agencies. We understand you may have come into possession of some historical materials that technically belong to the government. I'm a journalist. I come into possession of a lot of materials. These would be specific documents related to Cold War-era programs, CIA materials, classified materials that were never properly declassified despite their age." "I don't know what you're talking about." The man's smile didn't waver. "We're not here to cause problems, Mr. Mercer. We're authorised to retrieve these materials and ensure they're properly archived. There's no punishment involved, no charges. We just need the documents back." "Archived?" Eli repeated. "You mean destroyed?" "We prefer the term secured. These documents contain sensitive information, even after all these years. Unauthorised access to them could pose national security concerns." National security? Right. Because God forbid people learn what their government did to children in the name of fighting communists. The second man spoke for the first time, his voice flat and bureaucratic. "Mr. Mercer, we're trying to handle this quietly, but if necessary, we can obtain a warrant and make this much more complicated for everyone involved. We're asking nicely. Turn over the materials and this goes away. You can go back to your work. We can go back to ours. No one needs to know this conversation happened." "And if I don't?" The taller man's smile finally faded. "Then we stop asking nicely. Then we start looking into tax returns and financial records and professional licensing. We start talking to your editors and your sources. We make your life very difficult in ways that are perfectly legal and impossible to fight. That's a threat. That's a reality. You're holding materials that you weren't authorised to possess. We're offering you a way out. I'd suggest you take it. Get off my property." The 2 men looked at each other. Some unspoken communication passed between them. Then they both nodded to Eli and walked down the steps without another word. Eli closed the door and locked it, his heart pounding. He went to his window and watched them get into a black sedan parked across the street. They sat there for 10 minutes, just waiting, making sure he saw them. Then they drove away. He immediately called Marcus. "I need you to make copies of everything we digitised. Tonight, multiple copies, different locations." "What happened?" "They came to my apartment. Federal contractors, they said. Wanted the materials back." "Shit! Eli, maybe you should..." "I'm not giving them back." but I need the document secured. Can you do it? A pause. Then, yeah, bring everything over. I'll make copies, and we'll figure out a distribution plan. Eli started gathering the files, his hands working on autopilot while his brain tried to process what was happening. They'd found him within a week, which meant either the storage facility had alerted someone, or his phone calls to former CIA officers had triggered some kind of monitoring system, or the whole thing had been a setup from the beginning. What if someone wanted these files to be found? What if the package, the key, the signature, what if all of it was deliberate? But why? What purpose would it serve to leak evidence of crimes and then try to take it back? He didn't have answers. He just knew he needed to move fast. The storage facility called his cell phone as he was loading boxes into his car. "Mr. Mercer, this is Janet from Cambridge Self-Storage. I need to inform you that some men were here this morning with a federal warrant. They cleared out Unit 39. His heart sank. What did they take? Everything. The whole unit. They brought a truck. Took them about 2 hours to load it all up. They were very thorough. Did they leave anything? Let me check the log. Papers rustling. Yeah, actually. They left one item. A card. The manager said it seemed deliberate, like they wanted you to know they'd been there. I'll be right there." He drove to Cambridge in a daze, the implications settling over him like a weight. They had the original documents now. Everything he had were copies, photographs, digital files, still valuable, still publishable. But without the originals, proving authenticity would be harder. The unit was empty when he got there, just bare concrete walls and floor. In the centre of the space, sitting exactly where he'd found the first folder, was the index card. The same yellowed paper, the same signature, Sidney Gottlieb. But this time, there was something written on the back, in fresh ink, black and sharp. "You were always part of this." Eli stood in that empty storage unit for a long time, holding the card, trying to understand what it meant. The hidden tape. That night, Eli tore his apartment apart. He went through every box he'd brought back from the storage unit, every file he'd photographed, every note he'd taken. He was looking for anything he might have missed, any piece of evidence the contractors might not have found, anything that would help him make sense of what was happening. At 3 a.m, exhausted and running on pure adrenaline, he found it. The binder that had contained the Subproject 708 files was sitting on his couch, where he'd left it after photographing the contents. He picked it up to put it away and felt something shift inside the spine. He'd assumed the binder was empty now, all its contents photographed and catalogued. But the spine felt heavier than it should. He examined it closely. The interior lining was foam padding, common in archival binders to protect documents. But one section felt different. He pressed on it and felt something hard underneath. Using a knife, he carefully cut away the foam lining. Inside was a small cassette tape, the kind used in handheld recorders in the 80s and 90s. It had been pressed flat into a carved-out space in the foam, hidden so well that he'd handled the binder dozens of times without noticing. Its label read simply, "End Condition, Audio Only." His hands were shaking as he found an old cassette player in the back of his closet. He pressed play. Static. Then a voice. Male. Calm and measured. Not the voice from the other tapes. Someone older. "If you're hearing this, the program still works. You were selected because of your ability to uncover information, to pursue leads, to ask questions that others wouldn't ask. These are useful traits. These are traits we cultivated." Eli's breath caught in his throat. The voice continued. "Your involvement was not accidental. Your discovery of these files was not coincidental. We've been watching you for a very long time, Eli. Since you were a child. Since before you became a journalist. Since before you knew what questions to ask." A second voice now. Female. Older. With an accent he couldn't place, but that somehow felt familiar. Like something from a dream he couldn't quite remember. "Eli, your father was part of Subproject 708. He was not a subject. He was an administrator. He worked at Site Amber from 1961 to 1964, managing intake and behavioural assessments. He was good at his job, very good. He understood what we were trying to accomplish. Eli's vision went blurry. He sat down hard on his couch. The female voice went on, relentless. When the program was shut down, or rather, when it was officially shut down, your father was relocated, given a new identity, a new life. He was told the program had ended, that his work was classified but complete. He spent the rest of his life believing that. He died believing he'd left it all behind, the male voice returned. But programs like this never truly end, Eli. They evolve, they adapt, and sometimes they select new participants from the children of those who came before. You were always going to find this. The question was never if, only when, only whether you'd been properly prepared. The tape clicked off. Eli sat frozen, the cassette player still running, producing nothing but empty static. His father, who had died when Eli was 15. His father, who had always been quiet about his work, always deflecting questions about his past. His father, who had encouraged Eli to ask questions, to seek truth, to never accept the official story. His father, who had worked at a place called Sight Amber, doing God knows what to children. Eli's stomach churned. He stood up, walked to the bathroom and vomited. When he came back, he made himself listen to the tape again, and again, trying to find some flaw, some indication that it was a fabrication, a psychological operation designed to break him. But he couldn't. The voices sounded genuine, the details were too specific, and worse, the female voice was familiar in a way that suggested he'd heard it before, long ago in circumstances he couldn't quite remember. He thought about his childhood, tried to remember if there had been anything unusual, any gaps in his memory, any experiences that seemed strange looking back. And he found them. Small things. A hospital stay when he was 7 that his mother had always described as a routine testing, but that he couldn't quite remember. Dreams he'd had as a child, vivid and recurring, about rooms with white walls and voices asking him questions. A fear of certain sounds, high-pitched tones, specific combinations of notes that he'd never been able to explain. He'd always assumed these were just quirks of memory, the kind of strange half-recollections everyone has from childhood. But what if they weren't? The medical record. Dawn was breaking when Eli finally moved from the couch. His body felt heavy, like he was moving through water. He made coffee but couldn't drink it. Stood at his window watching the city wake up, watching normal people start their normal days. Then he remembered. His father's belongings. The boxes that had been sitting in his closet for 20 years, untouched since his mother had sent them after his father's funeral. Eli had been in college then, too overwhelmed with grief to go through them. Later, after graduation, after his career took off, he'd kept meaning to sort through them, but never quite found the time. Or maybe, some part of him had known not to look too closely. The boxes were in the back of his bedroom closet, covered with dust. 3 cardboard boxes labelled Dad's Things in his mother's handwriting. He opened them methodically, forcing himself to be thorough. Clothes that still smelled faintly of his father's cologne, books about history and government, a watch that had stopped working years ago, photo albums from before Eli was born. In the second box he found a manila envelope marked Medical Records, Confidential. His hands were shaking as he opened it. Inside was a file from Boston Children's Hospital, dated 1992. Eli would have been 7 years old. The file was thick, maybe 30 pages of forms and evaluations and test results. The cover sheet described it as a comprehensive psychological and developmental assessment, requested by Eli's primary care physician, due to concerns about attention and behavioural regulation. Eli didn't remember having any such concerns. He'd been a normal kid, maybe a little shy, but normal. He read through the forms, standard questions about behaviour, sleep patterns, social interaction. Then more specialised tests, memory assessments, response to stimuli, questions about imagination and suggestibility. The evaluating physician was listed as a specialist in child development. The name meant nothing to Eli. but the signature on the final page made his skin crawl. It was precise, careful, the same handwriting he'd seen on notes throughout the Constellation subject files. At the bottom of the final page, stamped in faded blue ink, was a symbol he recognised immediately. A circle with 12 points. The Constellation symbol. Below it, a designation. Candidate 13. And below that, a note in handwriting he now recognised as his father's. Subject displays high susceptibility to guided narrative construction and information-seeking behaviour. Pattern recognition skills above age-appropriate levels. Recommend continued passive observation. Further assessment at ages 14 and 21. Activation protocols to be determined pending behavioural development. Eli read it 5 times. 10 times. His father had written this. His father had evaluated him like he was a test subject. His father had recommended continued observation. Continued observation meant someone had been watching him for years, maybe his entire life. He thought about every major decision he'd made, his choice to become a journalist, his focus on investigative work, his obsession with uncovering hidden truths about government programs, the instinct that drove him to pursue stories even when they became dangerous, even when everyone told him to let them go. Had any of it been his choice? Or had he been conditioned from childhood to follow this exact path, to develop these exact skills, to serve some purpose he still didn't fully understand? He looked at the medical file again, flipped through the pages one more time looking for anything he'd missed. And there, tucked into the back of the file, he found a photograph. It showed him at 7 years old, sitting in what looked like a hospital room. He was drawing something, crayons spread out on a table in front of him. Behind him, partially visible in the background, was a woman in a white coat. Her face was turned away from the camera, but something about her posture, the way she stood, was familiar. He looked closer. On the wall behind her, barely visible, was a poster. The image was too small to make out clearly, but the shape was unmistakable. A constellation, 12 points arranged in a circle. The same symbol from the files. The same symbol stamped on his medical records. Eli sat on his bedroom floor, surrounded by his father's belongings, and tried to piece together a truth that was almost too vast to comprehend. The key had been sent to him deliberately. The storage unit had been maintained for decades, waiting. The signature had been left as a message, not from Sidney Gottlieb, but from whoever had continued his work. They had wanted him to find the files. They had wanted him to uncover Subproject 708. They had wanted him to learn about the children, the conditioning, the long-term monitoring, because he was one of them, not a subject exactly. Something else, something new, a second generation. The child of an administrator who had been enrolled in the program himself, evaluated and observed and shaped from childhood to become exactly what he'd become. An investigative journalist obsessed with uncovering government secrets. Someone who would inevitably find these files and pursue the truth no matter the cost. Someone whose entire life might be an experiment in whether the conditioning could be passed down, whether the traits could be cultivated without the brutal methods used on the original subjects. The final realization. Eli spent the next 2 days barely moving from his apartment. He didn't eat. He slept in fitful bursts, waking up every few hours with the feeling that someone was watching him. He reviewed everything again. Every file, every tape, every note, looking for confirmation or refutation of what he'd learned. The evidence was compelling, but not definitive. The medical file could be legitimate concern about a child's development. The photograph could be coincidence. His father's note could be... No, he couldn't lie to himself anymore. He thought about every major decision he'd made in his life. Tried to trace the origins of his interests, his obsessions, his compulsions. When had he first become interested in government secrets? Had it been after reading a book in high school, or had someone suggested that book? Had it been after seeing a documentary, or had someone made sure he saw that documentary? When had he decided to become a journalist? Had it been his own choice, or had his high school guidance counsellor steered him toward it? And who had recommended that counsellor? How many of his choices had actually been his own? The worst part was the uncertainty. He could never know for sure. Even if he spent the rest of his life analysing every decision, every influence, he could never be certain which thoughts were his and which had been planted. That uncertainty was worse than any definitive answer could be. He looked at his phone, at the contacts list of sources and editors, at the draft of the article he'd been preparing about Subproject 708. He could still publish it. He should publish it. The world deserved to know what had been done, what might still be being done. But what if publishing it was exactly what they wanted? What if his entire life had been preparation for this moment? What if the whole point of the experiment was to see if he would uncover the truth and expose it, proving that the conditioning worked not just on individuals but across generations? He thought about the index card left in the empty storage unit. You were always part of this. And he realised with a clarity that felt like ice water in his veins. Whoever sent him the key knew everything. They knew his history. They knew his father's history. They knew about the childhood evaluations, the passive observation, the decades of monitoring. They had been watching him for 37 years, waiting to see if the conditioning would hold, waiting to see if he would do exactly what he'd done. Find the files, read the documents, listen to the tapes, discover the truth about Subproject 708 and about himself. And in discovering it, prove that the program worked. Prove that you could shape a human life from childhood, cultivate specific traits and obsessions, guide someone down a predetermined path without them ever knowing they weren't making their own choices. The decision. Eli Jones sat in his apartment as November faded into December, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that had never truly ended, and realised he might never know which thoughts were his own, and which had been planted there decades ago by men in white coats who believed the mind was just another machine to be programmed. The worst part wasn't the uncertainty. The worst part was that, even knowing all of this, even understanding that he might be a puppet dancing on strings he couldn't see, he was still going to publish the story. Because that's what they had made him to do. Or maybe it was what he'd chosen to do, and they'd just known him well enough to predict it. Or maybe there was no difference anymore. He looked at the draft article on his laptop. 10,000 words documenting Subproject 708, the Constellation Children, the decades of monitoring, all of it backed up by photographs of documents and digital copies of tapes. Enough to cause a scandal, enough to trigger investigations, enough to force the government to admit to crimes that went beyond even the acknowledged horrors of MKUltra. He thought about the men who had come to his door, the warning they'd given, the threat to make his life difficult. They could have silenced him. They could have made him disappear. But they hadn't. Because maybe they didn't need to. Maybe they already knew how this would end. His phone rang. Marcus. Have you made a decision? I'm publishing it. Even knowing, especially knowing, if I don't publish because I'm afraid I'm being manipulated, then they've won anyway. At least this way the truth gets out. At least people will know what was done. And if you're doing exactly what they want, then maybe what they want and what should happen are the same thing. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the whole experiment was to see if they could create someone who would expose the truth, even if it destroyed them. A long pause, then, when? Tomorrow. I'll send it to every outlet that might publish it. Major papers, independent journalists, whistleblower sites, all at once. Make it impossible to suppress. Be careful, Eli. It's too late for careful. He hung up and went back to the article. Read through it one more time, making sure every claim was supported, every source was documented, every detail was as accurate as he could make it. Then he looked at the index card one final time. The signature, the message on the back. You were always part of this. And he realised something that made him laugh, though there was no humour in it. They were right. He had always been part of this. But that didn't mean he had to be what they wanted him to be. Maybe they'd shaped him to uncover secrets. Maybe they'd cultivated his obsessive pursuit of truth. Maybe they'd even known he would eventually discover his own connection to the program. But they couldn't control what he did with that knowledge. They couldn't control whether he chose to see himself as a victim or as someone who could use their own methods against them. They couldn't control the story he would tell. Eli opened his laptop and added one final section to the article. A personal note at the end describing his own possible connection to the program. His father's role, the medical records, the childhood photographs, the possibility that he himself was a subject or candidate, or whatever term they'd used. He included the photograph from his medical file, his 7-year-old self drawing with crayons, unaware that he was being evaluated like a laboratory animal. He wrote, "I may never know if my interest in this story was truly my own, or if I was conditioned from childhood to pursue exactly this type of investigation. I may never know if my entire career has been an extension of an experiment that began before I was born. But I do know this. The children in these files deserved better. They deserve protection, not exploitation. They deserve childhoods, not conditioning. And they deserve to have their stories told, even if telling them serves someone else's purpose. Even if I'm exactly what they made me to be, I can still choose to use that to expose what they did. That choice, at least, is mine." He saved the document, queued up the emails to a dozen different outlets, attached all the supporting documentation. His finger hovered over the send button. In some office he would never find, someone was probably watching, waiting to see what happened next. The program, after all, was still running. It had never stopped. And Eli Jones was just the latest subject to prove it worked. But he was also the one who was going to make sure the world knew. He pressed send. Epilogue. The story broke 3 days later. The Washington Post published it first, followed within hours by the New York Times, The Guardian, and a dozen other outlets. Within a week, it was the lead story on every major news network. Congressional committees announced investigations. The CIA issued a statement neither confirming nor denying, which everyone understood as confirmation. Eli gave interviews, appeared on television, answered questions from investigators, and every night he went home to his apartment and wondered if this was what they'd wanted all along. The attention, the scandal, the investigations that would ultimately go nowhere because too many people were dead and too many records were destroyed and too much time had passed. Maybe the whole point was to create a release valve. Let some truth out in a controlled way. Make people angry enough to feel like something had been exposed, but not angry enough to actually change anything. Or maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe sometimes a whistleblower was just a whistleblower. Not every revelation was part of some deeper game. He wanted to believe that. He tried to believe that. But late at night, when he couldn't sleep, he would think about the card left in the empty storage unit. You were always part of this. And he would wonder if he'd ever truly had a choice at all. Somewhere, in an office he would never find, someone was probably still watching, still taking notes, still documenting the results of an experiment that had been running for 40 years. The program worked. It had always worked. And Eli Jones had just proven it one more time. A massive thank you to Dogface680 and so many others who suggested this incredible topic. Your video ideas keep this channel going. If you have suggestions for future videos, please drop them in the comments below. Now, let's dive into one of the most chilling government experiments you've never heard of. Some secrets don't get buried, they get frozen. In March 2004, something happened inside a sealed laboratory at Sandia National Laboratories in New Mexico. The official record says nothing. The budget documentation lists a single line item: Applied Chronophysics Integration. The project lead, a brilliant Air Force physicist named David Lewis Anderson, walked into a temporal containment field for a routine 10-minute test. That was 21 years ago. For Anderson, those 10 minutes still haven't ended. This is the story of how the United States military accidentally trapped a man in time and why they might never be able to bring him back. March 1999, Rome, New York. The Air Force Research Laboratory at Griffiths Air Force Base didn't look like the kind of place where reality could be rewritten. Low brick buildings, chain-link fences, security badges that beeped at turnstiles. It was the kind of facility that processed grants for satellite communication upgrades and radar improvements. The unglamorous backbone of military research. David Lewis Anderson worked in Building 7, 3rd floor, in an office that smelled like burnt coffee and ozone. At 32, he was one of the youngest civilian physicists on the USAF, Time-Related Research Program, a division so obscure that most airmen on the base didn't know it existed. Anderson's specialty was electromagnetic field manipulation, specifically how rotating magnetic fields affected subatomic particles in ways that classical physics couldn't quite explain. He'd noticed something strange during a routine particle confinement experiment. Decay rates inside his toroidal field chamber were slightly slower than they should have been. Not by much, a fraction of a microsecond. But it was measurable, repeatable, and according to Einstein's theory of relativity, it meant one thing: time inside the field was moving slower than time outside it. Anderson had stumbled onto this discovery almost by accident. He'd been running experiments on particle containment for the better part of 2 years, trying to develop more efficient methods for stabilizing unstable isotopes. The military applications were obvious. If you could slow radioactive decay, you could store nuclear materials more safely, transport them more easily, extend their operational lifespan. But what Anderson found was far more profound. He'd been using cesium-137, a radioactive isotope with a half-life of about 30 years, as his test subject. Standard procedure was to measure the decay rate both inside and outside the containment field to ensure the field wasn't interfering with the isotope's stability, except the decay rate inside the field was consistently slower. At first, Anderson thought it was measurement error. He recalibrated his instruments. He ran the test again and again. The results were identical every time. The cesium inside the field was decaying more slowly than it should. Not dramatically, we're talking fractions of microseconds, but consistently, measurably slower. Anderson knew what this meant. Radioactive decay is one of the most consistent processes in nature, a fundamental clock that ticks at the same rate regardless of temperature, pressure, or chemical environment. The only thing that can change decay rates is time itself. He spent 3 weeks reviewing the data, checking for every possible alternative explanation. He consulted with colleagues, carefully avoiding any mention of his hypothesis. He reviewed every paper ever published on time dilation, from Einstein's original work to the most recent experiments with atomic clocks. Finally, he was certain he'd created a temporal distortion field. On March 17th, 1999, Anderson filed an internal white paper with the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. The title was dry, academic, deliberately understated: Preliminary Model for Controlled Temporal Fields in Particle Confinement. Inside, the implications were staggering. Anderson theorized that by rotating electromagnetic fields at precise frequencies, it might be possible to create a localized distortion in space-time, a bubble where time moved at a different rate than the surrounding environment. Not time travel exactly, time dilation. a pocket of slow time. The mechanism, he explained, was related to frame-dragging effects predicted by general relativity. When massive objects rotate, they drag space-time along with them. Earth does this. It's called the lens-throwing effect. But the distortion is minuscule, barely measurable even with the most sensitive instruments. But what if you could amplify that effect? What if, instead of rotating mass, you rotated electromagnetic fields at enormous intensities? The math suggested it was possible. The experimental data suggested he'd already done it. The paper was 17 pages long. It included equations, experimental data, and a cautious conclusion. Further research recommended to determine scalability and practical applications. Anderson submitted the paper on a Wednesday afternoon. By Friday morning, his lab was swarming with visitors. They didn't identify themselves by name, just by agency. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, National Security Agency, a civilian liaison from the Department of Energy. They asked questions. They reviewed his data. They examined his equipment with the kind of intensity that made Anderson deeply uncomfortable. 3 months later, Anderson's lab was shut down. The official explanation was budget reallocation. His funding, roughly $2 million annually, was transferred to a classified DARPA project called the Quantum Waveform Defense Initiative. Anderson was told his research would continue under the new program, just in a different capacity. He was also told not to publish his findings. The meeting where they delivered the news took place in a windowless conference room on base. There were 4 people present: Anderson, his supervisor, and 2 men in dark suits who never gave their names. One of them slid a document across the table, a non-disclosure agreement. 23 pages of legal language that boiled down to this: everything Anderson had discovered about time dilation was now classified. Talking about it publicly would be a federal crime. Publishing it would be treason. Anderson had spent his entire career in pursuit of scientific knowledge. The idea that his greatest discovery would be locked away, hidden from the world, was devastating. But he signed the agreement. What choice did he have? In July 1999, Anderson left the Air Force. He moved to Long Island and founded the Anderson Institute, a private research organisation dedicated to what he called time control research for humanitarian use. The website featured photos of sleek laboratories and optimistic descriptions of future applications: medical stasis, space travel, advanced computing. What the website didn't mention was that Anderson's Air Force security clearance remained active for another 6 years, or that he'd signed a non-disclosure agreement with the Department of Defense that classified his research under the same legal framework used for nuclear weapons development, or that his departure from the Air Force wasn't really a departure at all. 2001 to 2003, Long Island, New York. The Anderson Institute operated out of a converted industrial building in Hopogue, a suburb 40 miles east of Manhattan. From the outside, it looked like any other tech startup. Glass doors, modernist furniture, a receptionist who smiled and asked visitors to sign in. Inside, Anderson was building something extraordinary. He called it the T3 time field generator. The device was deceptively simple in concept. A toroidal magnetic coil, about the size of a washing machine, capable of generating rotating electromagnetic fields at frequencies precise to the nanosecond. Suspended in the centre of the coil was a vacuum chamber where test subjects, particles, molecules, eventually small objects, could be placed. The goal was to create a measurable time differential. If successful, the clock inside the field would tick slower than a clock outside it. Anderson's funding came from a mix of private investors and anonymous grants. He suspected, correctly, that at least some of the money was coming from government sources, filtered through shell companies and defence contractors. But he didn't ask questions. The work was too important. The first prototype was completed in March 2001. It was crude, cobbled together from salvaged equipment and commercial components. The magnetic coils were wrapped by hand. The control systems were jury-rigged from laboratory surplus, but it worked. The first test was conducted on March 23, 2001 at 3:47 a.m. Anderson had been working for 36 hours straight, fueled by coffee and the kind of manic energy that comes from being on the verge of a breakthrough. He placed a quartz clock inside the vacuum chamber. Simple, mechanical, the kind of clock you could buy at any department store. Outside the chamber, he placed an identical clock, synchronized to the nanosecond using a GPS time signal. Then he activated the field. For the first 30 seconds, nothing happened. The coils hummed. The chamber vibrated slightly. Anderson watched the clocks, waiting. Then he noticed it. The clock inside the chamber was running slow, just barely but visibly. A second would pass on the external clock, and the internal clock would advance only by 0.999997 seconds. 3 microseconds of dilation per second. It doesn't sound like much. 3 millionths of a second. But in the world of experimental physics, it was groundbreaking. Proof that time could be manipulated, controlled, slowed. Anderson ran the test again, and again. The results were consistent. Over the next 2 years, he refined the design. Larger coils, more powerful magnets, better control systems. By late 2002, he'd achieved dilation rates of up to 10 microseconds per second. The T3 could slow time by 1%. He published a brief paper in an obscure physics journal. The reaction from the scientific community was muted, skeptical. Time dilation had been observed before, in particle accelerators, in atomic clocks on airplanes, but always as a byproduct of extreme speed or gravity. Anderson was claiming he could do it with stationary electromagnetic fields. Most physicists dismissed it as experimental error. A few expressed polite interest. None of them took it seriously, but not everyone was skeptical. In 2002, DARPA released a roadmap document titled Quantum Information Science and Technology, Strategic Vision and Research Plan. Buried on page 87, under a section labelled Areas of Strategic Interest, was a single line. Localized temporal phase anomalies. No explanation, no context, just those 4 words. Anderson saw the document and knew immediately what it meant. The military was interested in his work. They were pursuing it, probably through multiple channels, funding research at universities and national labs under innocuous-sounding program names. He wasn't the only one working on time control. He was just the only one doing it publicly. In September 2002, Anderson was invited to present his work at a small physics symposium in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The venue was a hotel conference room, the kind of place usually reserved for corporate training seminars. The audience was fewer than 30 people, mostly academics and a handful of government observers who sat in the back row and didn't ask questions. Anderson's presentation was cautious, technical. He showed data. He explained the theory. He suggested potential applications, space travel where astronauts could age more slowly, computational systems that could process information faster than normal time, medical stasis for patients awaiting treatment. He didn't mention the military applications, but everyone in the room was thinking about them. One man in the audience took detailed notes, careful, methodical notes filling page after page of a leather-bound notebook. Lieutenant Colonel James A. Ransone, a liaison for the U.S. Air Force Research Laboratory Directed Energy Division. Ransone had a background in advanced weapons systems, lasers, microwave emitters, particle beams. He understood the potential of Anderson's work better than most of the civilians in the room. A time dilation field wasn't just a scientific curiosity, it was a weapon, a tool, a way to tilt the battlefield in ways that no enemy could counter. After the presentation, Ransone introduced himself. He was polite, professional, careful not to seem too eager. He congratulated Anderson on his work. He asked a few technical questions, the kind that demonstrated genuine understanding. 3 weeks later, Anderson received a phone call. Ransone was calling from Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado. He got straight to the point. The Air Force was interested in exploring potential defense applications of Anderson's research. They wanted to fund a full-scale demonstration. State-of-the-art equipment, unlimited budget, access to the best physicists in the country. Anderson hesitated. He'd left the Air Force to pursue independent research, to avoid the secrecy and restrictions of military projects. But Ransone made an offer he couldn't refuse. Not just funding, recognition. If the experiment succeeded, Anderson's name would be attached to one of the greatest scientific breakthroughs in history, the man who proved that time could be controlled. There was also an implicit threat, though Ransone never stated it directly. Anderson's research was already classified. The non-disclosure agreement he'd signed in 1999 was still active. If he refused to cooperate, the government could shut down his institute, seize his equipment, and bury his work under classification orders. He could cooperate, or he could be silenced. In December 2002, Anderson signed a contract with the Department of Defense. He told himself he was doing it for science, for the chance to pursue his research at a scale that would have been impossible otherwise. But deep down, he knew the truth. He'd never really left the Air Force. He'd just been working off-site. 2004, Sandia National Laboratories, New Mexico. Sandia. National Laboratories sits on the edge of Albuquerque, a sprawling complex of buildings and bunkers tucked into the desert foothills. It's one of 3 labs in the United States responsible for maintaining the nuclear stockpile, a place where the cutting edge of physics meets the blunt reality of weapons development. Anderson arrived in January 2004. The project had a name now, Kronos. The acronym stood for something bureaucratic and forgettable: Kinetic Resonance Observation and Neutralization Operation System, but everyone involved knew what it really meant. Kronos, the Greek god of time, the titan who devoured his children. The symbolism wasn't lost on Anderson. Time devours everything eventually. But what if you could slow it down? What if you could make a single moment last forever? The goal was simple: build a scalable temporal containment field, something larger than Anderson's original prototype, something that could hold not just particles but objects, eventually maybe even people. The official justification was national security. Temporal stasis field could revolutionize warfare, freeze enemy munitions in mid-flight, store unstable isotopes indefinitely, create unbreakable communication delays that would make code breaking impossible. But Anderson knew the real reason the military was interested. If you could slow time, you could speed up everything else. A soldier in a time-dilated field could train for months while only hours passed in the outside world. A weapons lab could run decades of research in a fraction of the time. An intelligence agency could interrogate prisoners for years without anyone noticing they'd been gone. The ethical implications were staggering. Anderson tried not to think about them. The lab was located in Building 6580, a reinforced concrete structure with no windows and 3 layers of security clearance. The building was technically part of Sandia's Z-Machine complex, the facility that housed the most powerful X-ray generator on Earth. But Building 6580 existed in a kind of bureaucratic limbo, not listed on official maps, accessed through a separate gate that required special authorization. The equipment was the best Anderson had ever worked with. Superconducting magnets capable of generating fields measured in tens of Tesla. Precision atomic clocks accurate to 1 second in 300 million years. Quantum sensors capable of detecting fluctuations in space-time down to the Planck scale. The smallest measurable unit of distance in the universe. The team was small: Anderson, 2 Air Force physicists named Chen and Rodriguez, a handful of engineers, and Lieutenant Colonel Ransone, who observed every test with the quiet intensity of a man who knew this project could change the world. There were also observers, men and women who never gave their names, who sat in a separate control room behind reinforced glass and watched everything through cameras. Anderson assumed they were intelligence analysts, or maybe military strategists trying to figure out how to weaponize his discovery. He tried not to think about them either. The new design was based on Anderson's T3 prototype, but scaled up dramatically. The magnetic coils were arranged in a nested toroidal configuration, creating a containment field that was both more stable and more powerful. The control systems used quantum computers to adjust the field parameters in real time, compensating for fluctuations and maintaining coherence. The containment chamber itself was a cylinder, about 8 feet in diameter and 10 feet tall, large enough to hold equipment, instruments, eventually a person. The first test was scheduled for early March. They started small. a simple atomic clock placed inside the chamber and monitored for temporal anomalies. The field was activated for 5 minutes, running at low power. The clock fell behind by half a second. The second test ran for 10 minutes at higher power. The clock fell behind by 3 seconds. The third test ran for 15 minutes at maximum power. The clock fell behind by 22 seconds. The field was working. Not just working, exceeding expectations. The dilation rates were far higher than anything Anderson had achieved in his Long Island lab. But there was a problem. The field was stable, too stable. Once activated, it showed no signs of decay or degradation. The magnetic coils spun at precise frequencies. The energy levels remained constant. The space-time distortion held steady. In theory, that was good. A stable field meant predictable, controllable time dilation. But it also meant the field didn't want to shut down. The engineers had to manually collapse the magnetic fields, forcing the system offline. And each time they did, the instruments detected strange fluctuations, brief spikes in radiation, gravitational anomalies, distortions in the local electromagnetic field. Anderson compared it to popping a soap bubble. The bubble is stable as long as the surface tension holds, but when it breaks, the energy has to go somewhere. Rodriguez, one of the Air Force physicists, ran simulations. The results were troubling. If a large-scale temporal field collapsed suddenly, especially one containing a significant mass, the energy release could be catastrophic. Not nuclear bomb catastrophic, but enough to cause serious damage. And if something living were inside the field at the moment of collapse... Rodriguez didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The team decided to proceed with extreme caution. The next test would be longer, more ambitious. They would activate the field for 30 minutes and monitor it continuously, gathering data on stability, coherence, and energy consumption. The test was designated Cycle 11C. It was scheduled for March 12, 2004. March 12th, 2004, 2:06 p.m. Mountain Time. Anderson stood in the control room watching the technicians make final preparations. The containment chamber sat in the centre of the lab, surrounded by diagnostic equipment and safety barriers. The magnetic coils were already humming, running through their pre-activation sequence. Inside the chamber, they placed an array of instruments: atomic clocks, radiation detectors, temperature sensors, cameras, everything they'd need to monitor conditions inside the field. Ransone stood beside Anderson, arms crossed, watching the same scene through the reinforced glass. "This is it," Ransone said quietly. "If this test succeeds, we move to Phase 2. "Which is?" Anderson asked, though he already knew the answer. "Human testing." Anderson felt a knot form in his stomach. He'd always known it would come to this. You couldn't revolutionize warfare, or medicine, or space travel, or any of the other applications, without eventually putting a person inside the field. But the idea still made him uneasy. "We'll need to run more tests first," Anderson said. "Animals, at least. Mice, then something larger. We need to understand the biological effects." "We understand enough," Ransone interrupted. "The field doesn't affect matter directly. It affects time, and biology operates on the same time as everything else. If the field is safe for a clock, it's safe for a person," Anderson wanted to argue. But the logic was sound, even if the conclusion made him uncomfortable. At 2 p.m, the final checks were complete. Rodriguez gave the signal. The technicians cleared the lab, retreating behind safety barriers. At 2:06 p.m. and 27 seconds, Anderson pressed the activation button. The magnetic coils spun up to full power. The air inside the chamber shimmered, distorting like heat waves rising off the asphalt. The instruments registered the familiar signatures of temporal distortion, gravitational anomalies, electromagnetic fluctuations, a subtle warping of space itself. The atomic clocks inside the chamber began to fall behind. For the first 5 minutes, everything proceeded normally. The field held steady. The instruments transmitted data continuously. The dilation rate stabilized at approximately 4.2%, meaning time inside the field was passing about 4.2% slower than outside. At 2:15 p.m, something changed. The dilation rate increased. Not by much, just a few tenths of a percent, but it was unexpected. The field was supposed to be stable. Anderson checked the control systems. Everything was normal. The magnetic coils were operating within parameters. The energy levels were steady, but the dilation rate kept climbing. 4.5%, 4.8%, 5.1%. What's happening? Ransone asked. I don't know, Anderson admitted. The field's stabilizing at a higher dilation rate than we calculated. Is that a problem? Anderson didn't answer immediately. He was running calculations in his head, comparing the observed data to the theoretical predictions. It shouldn't be, he said finally. The field's still coherent. It's just stronger than expected. By 2:30 p.m, the dilation rate had stabilized at 6.7%. The atomic clocks inside the chamber were now falling behind by about 4 seconds every minute, which meant that for every hour that passed outside the chamber, only about 56 minutes passed inside. The test was supposed to run for 30 minutes of external time. Inside the chamber, that would be about 28 minutes. But Anderson made a decision. He decided to enter the chamber himself. It wasn't planned. Ransone objected immediately. The engineers protested, but Anderson was adamant. We need to know what it's like inside, he said. I'll go in for 10 minutes. That's less than 9.5 minutes for me. I'll observe, take notes, and come right back out. This is insane, Rodriguez said. We haven't tested this on anything living. I'll be fine, Anderson insisted. The field doesn't cause physical harm. It just slows time. I won't even feel it. Ransone considered for a long moment. Then he nodded. 10 minutes, he said. External time. We shut down the field at 2:47 p.m. exactly, whether you're ready or not. Anderson agreed. He entered the containment chamber at 2:37 p.m. From Anderson's perspective, entering the chamber was unremarkable. The air felt normal, the temperature was comfortable, the lighting was slightly dim, but that was just the design of the chamber. He could hear the hum of the magnetic coils, a deep thrumming sound that resonated in his chest, but it wasn't unpleasant. He checked his watch. 2:37 p.m. The plan was simple. Stay inside for 10 minutes, observe conditions, document everything, then exit and report his findings. Anderson walked around the interior of the chamber examining the instruments. The atomic clocks were running normally. From his perspective, he knew they were falling behind the external clocks, but he couldn't perceive the difference. Time felt normal. He spoke into a digital voice recorder documenting his observations. 2:38 p.m, internal conditions nominal. No discomfort, no unusual sensations. Temperature approximately 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Lighting adequate. Acoustic environment normal apart from the magnetic coil hum. He checked the instruments. Radiation levels normal. Electromagnetic field strength within expected parameters. 2:40 p.m. All systems appear stable. No adverse effects observed. Subjective experience of time appears normal, which is consistent with relativity theory. From my reference frame, time is passing at the normal rate. The dilation is only apparent from an external frame. He continued his observations, checking instruments, taking measurements, speaking into the recorder. 2:43 p.m. Midpoint of observation period. Continuing to feel normal. No dizziness, nausea or disorientation. Cognitive function appears unaffected. He glanced at his watch again. 2:44 p.m. 6 minutes had passed for him. Outside, it would be close to 6.5 minutes, maybe 7 given the increased dilation rate. He had about 4 more minutes to go. Anderson decided to conduct a simple cognitive test. He recited the first 50 digits of pi from memory, then performed several mental arithmetic calculations. Everything seemed normal. His mind was sharp, his thoughts clear. 2:46 p.m. cognitive function test complete. No deficits detected, preparing to exit. He stopped mid-sentence. Something was wrong. Not with him, with the field. He could feel it now. A subtle change in the air pressure, a slight increase in the magnetic field intensity. The hum of the coils was getting louder, deeper. Anderson looked at the instruments. The electromagnetic field strength was increasing, not dramatically, but measurably. Outside, he knew the technicians would be seeing the same data. They'd be debating whether to shut down the field early. He checked his watch. 2:47 p.m, time to exit. He walked to the chamber door and reached for the handle. It didn't move. Anderson tried again, pulling harder. The door was sealed tight. He spoke into the recorder, trying to keep his voice calm. 2:47 p.m. Door appears to be sealed. Possibly a safety interlock. We'll wait for technicians to open from outside. He waited. 1 minute passed, then 2. His watch read 2:49 p.m. For him, 12 minutes had elapsed since he'd entered the chamber. But outside, if his calculations were correct, it would be close to 2:50 p.m, 13 minutes of external time. They should have opened the door by now. Anderson felt the first flicker of concern. Outside the chamber, panic was setting in. At 2:47 p.m, as planned, the technicians began the shutdown sequence. They reduced power to the magnetic coils, initiating the controlled collapse of the temporal field. But the field didn't collapse. The dilation rate decreased slightly, dropping from 6.7% to about 6.5%. But the field remained stable, coherent, active. "It's not shutting down," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with stress. Ransone leaned over the control console. "Why not?" "I don't know. The magnetic field should be decaying, but they're holding steady. It's like the field has achieved some kind of equilibrium state. It's self-sustaining." Anderson, inside the chamber, was still visible on the video monitors. He was standing by the door, clearly trying to exit. Ransone made a decision. Open the door manually, emergency override. The technicians tried. The door was magnetically sealed, designed to maintain the integrity of the containment environment. The override should have released it, but it didn't work. "The magnetic field is interfering with the locking mechanism," one engineer reported. "We can't open it while the field is active." "Then collapse the field," Ransone ordered. "We're trying, sir." It's not responding. Inside the chamber, Anderson had figured out what was happening. The field had stabilized at a higher energy state than expected, and now it was trapped in that state. Shutting it down would require more than just reducing power to the coils. It would require a complete reconfiguration of the system, possibly even a forced magnetic collapse. But that would be dangerous. A sudden collapse could create a temporal shear, a violent reintegration of the time differential. Inside the chamber, where time was passing 6.5% slower, Anderson would experience the collapse as a sudden acceleration. His body would be forced to catch up with external time in an instant. The energy release would be catastrophic. Rodriguez was running the same calculations. His face had gone pale. "If we force the collapse," he said quietly, "the temporal shear could kill him." Ransone stared at the monitor, watching Anderson pace inside the chamber. "What are our options?" "We keep the field running," Rodriguez said. "Maintain it indefinitely until we can figure out a way to safely bring it down." "How long?" "I don't know. Days, weeks, maybe longer." Inside the chamber, Anderson checked his watch. 2:53 p.m. For him, 16 minutes had passed. Outside, it was approximately 2:54 p.m., 17 minutes. He'd expected to be out by now. The test should have been over, but the door was still sealed and he could hear the coils still humming. Something had gone wrong. Over the next several hours, external time, the team at Sandia tried everything. They attempted to gradually reduce the field strength, hoping to slowly bring the dilation rate down to 0. But every time they adjusted the power, the field compensated, maintaining its equilibrium. They tried to override the door locks mechanically, using hydraulic tools to force it open, but the magnetic field was too strong, interfering with the mechanisms. They even considered cutting through the chamber walls with plasma torches, but the chamber was designed to contain radiation and electromagnetic fields. The walls were reinforced with layers of new metal and lead. Cutting through them would take days, and all the while Anderson was inside, unaware of the crisis unfolding around him. From his perspective, only about 90 minutes had passed. He'd tried the door periodically, spoken into his recorder, documented his situation. He was concerned but not panicked. He assumed the delay was technical, that the team was working on the problem. He had no idea they couldn't get him out. By 8 p.m. external time, about 7:30 p.m. for Anderson, the situation was clear. The field wasn't going to collapse naturally. It would continue running indefinitely, or until the power supply failed, and forcing it to collapse would kill Anderson. Ransoni convened an emergency meeting with the project leads. Anderson was still visible on the monitors, sitting inside the chamber, reading a technical manual he'd found on a shelf. "We have 3 options," Rodriguez said. 1. We keep the field running indefinitely and hope we eventually figure out how to safely collapse it. 2. We cut power to the facility, which will force an immediate collapse and almost certainly kill Anderson. 3. We seal the chamber permanently and leave him in there. The room was silent. "Option 3 isn't an option," Ranson said firmly. "We're not abandoning him." "Then we go with option 1, Rodriguez replied. "We maintain the field, we keep monitoring, and we research. Maybe we'll find a solution." It was decided. The field would continue running. The chamber would be sealed, not permanently but securely to prevent accidental interference. The entire module would be classified at the highest level, and research would continue in secret. They would find a way to save Anderson. They had to. But weeks passed, then months, and the field remained stable, unyielding. Inside the chamber, Anderson's watch showed that only about 6 hours had passed. He was confused, frustrated, but still hopeful. He assumed the delay was temporary, that the team was working on a solution. He had no way of knowing that outside the world was moving on without him. August 2005. The Anderson Institute's website went dark on August 14th, 2005. There was no announcement, no explanation. One day the site was live. Photos of laboratories, press releases, contact information. The next day, it was gone. Replaced by a blank page with a single line of text. Experiments currently suspended for government collaboration. Anderson's colleagues were given minimal information. They were told he'd taken a long-term consulting position with the government, working on classified projects at an undisclosed location. They were asked politely but firmly not to discuss the nature of his work. Most accepted the explanation. A few were suspicious. One engineer, Thomas Keller, couldn't let it go. He'd worked with Anderson for 3 years, building the T3 prototype, refining the designs. They'd been friends. And now Anderson had vanished without a word, without even a goodbye. Keller sent emails, they bounced back. He tried calling, the numbers were disconnected. Finally, in September 2005, Keller drove to Sandia National Laboratories. He showed up at the main gate, asked to speak with Anderson, said it was urgent. Security escorted him off the property. 2 weeks later, Keller received a visit from 2 men in dark suits. They identified themselves as Department of Defense investigators. They asked him about his relationship with Anderson. They asked if he'd shared any information about the time dilation experiments. They reminded him that violating a federal non-disclosure agreement carried a prison sentence of up to 10 years. Keller never spoke about Anderson again. Meanwhile, at Sandia, the sealed chamber sat in building 6580, humming quietly, ignored by everyone except a handful of technicians who monitored it remotely. Inside, Anderson had no idea that 18 months of external time had passed. For him, it was still March 12th, 2004. Only about 11 hours had elapsed since he'd entered the chamber. He'd stopped speaking into the recorder. He'd stopped trying the door. He'd settled into a kind of routine, sleeping, reading the technical manuals stored in the chamber, doing exercises to stay physically fit. He'd long since figured out that something had gone seriously wrong. But he also knew that panicking wouldn't help. The team outside would fix the problem. They had to. He just had to wait. 2010. The hacker collective called themselves Black Obelisk. They specialised in infiltrating government contractor networks, exploiting the weak security that often existed in the civilian companies that serviced classified projects. In March 2010, they hit Los Alamos National Laboratory, or rather, they hit a contractor that managed the lab's email servers. The cache they released was enormous, thousands of documents, most of them mundane, budget reports, personnel evaluations, equipment manifests. But buried in the archive was a PDF titled Temporal Field Integrity Log, Test Cycle 11C. The document detailed the March 2004 test at Sandia. It listed Anderson as the test subject, and it included a chilling line in the final entry. Subject remains in containment, field stable, extraction impossible without catastrophic temporal shear, recommend indefinite maintenance protocol. The internet exploded with speculation, forums filled with theories, but within 48 hours every copy of the document vanished. Websites were scrubbed, servers were seized. Black Obelisk went silent. The story faded into conspiracy theory territory, dismissed as an elaborate hoax. But a few copies survived, hidden in encrypted drives and dark web archives, and some people believed. 2022, Brooklyn, New York. Elena Warren was researching Cold War DARPA projects for a podcast when she stumbled across a reference to the Quantum Waveform Defense Initiative in a declassified memo. She filed FOIA requests. She tracked down Anderson's old patents. She found the Black Obelisk leak archived on an obscure server. Most importantly, she found a pattern. Equipment transfers from Sandia to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in 2006. A sealed module labelled Kronos, do not open. She traced the module's current location. It was still there, in a sub-basement facility at Wright-Patterson, consuming electricity 24 hours a day. Still running. March 2023. Elena found Gary Holcomb, a retired Air Force technician who'd maintained the electrical systems at Sandia during the Kronos project. He was dying of cancer and he decided to talk. The field never shut down, Holcomb told her over coffee at a small Arizona diner. They couldn't collapse it without killing him, so they just kept it running, built a containment structure around it, moved the whole thing to Wright-Patterson. Is he still alive? Elena asked. Depends on how you define alive, Holcomb said. For us it's been 20 years. For him it's been maybe a day and a half at most. Can they ever bring him out? Holcomb shook his head slowly. The math doesn't work. The temporal differential is too large now. If they collapse the field, his body will try to sync with external time instantly. The energy release would be... He trailed off. They ran simulations. Every scenario ends the same way. Elena recorded everything. 2 hours of testimony. She titled the file chronology_Anderson final.wave. 2 weeks later, Holcomb died. Natural causes, the death certificate said. But when Elena checked her recording, something impossible had happened. The file's metadata showed a creation date of March 12th, 2004, 14:06:27. The same moment Anderson had entered the chamber. No outlet would publish her story. Legal departments cited national security concerns. Editors called it too risky. The investigation died, but Eleanor kept the files. October 2024. Late one night, the Anderson Institute's website came back online. The page was simple, black background, white text. Temporal field integrity 100%. Containment status, holdings March 12th, 2004, 14:06:27. Active. The timestamp didn't move. It stayed frozen at that exact moment. Someone examined the page's source code and found a hidden comment. For David Lewis Anderson, only 27 hours had passed since he entered the chamber. He was still inside, still alive, still waiting for someone to open the door and tell him the test was over. Outside, 21 years had gone by. The website stayed live for 3 days, then vanished. But screenshots circulated. The timestamp became an internet legend. Proof that somewhere in a sealed basement at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, a man was trapped in a moment that would never end. The field continued to hum. The magnetic coils continued to spin, and time inside that chamber moved infinitely slower than the world outside. Time dilation is real. Einstein proved it. Astronauts age slower in space. Atomic clocks tick differently at different altitudes. But localized time dilation created by electromagnetic fields. The physics is theoretical. Possible perhaps, but unproven. Unless it has been proven, and the results are locked away behind classification orders that will never expire. If the military did succeed in creating a temporal containment field, if they did trap a man inside it, We would never know. The technology would be buried under the same legal protections as nuclear weapons. The researchers would be silenced, the evidence would disappear. And if someone were trapped inside, caught in a bubble of slow time that could never be safely collapsed, there would be no rescue, no happy ending. Just a man, waiting in a moment that never ends while the world outside moves on without him. Somewhere in the classified depths of a military facility, a timestamp blinks on a monitor. March 12th, 2004, 14:06:27, active. For David Lewis Anderson, the test is still running. It might run forever. Before we begin tonight's investigation, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It truly helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know, and we're incredibly grateful for your support. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. Now let's dive into tonight's story. A massive thank you to Know Thyself for suggesting tonight's investigation. This one goes deep. Project Bluebeam. The activation file. There are conspiracy theories, and then there are conspiracy theories built on foundations so solid, so verifiable, that calling them theories starts to feel uncomfortable. What you're about to hear isn't fiction dressed up as fact. It's fact dressed up as something we desperately want to remain fiction. In January of the year following the most divisive election in modern American history, a reporter in Montreal opened a box that had been sitting in a storage unit for 20 years. Inside that box was evidence of a program that, according to official records, never existed. According to the people who worked on it, it was never supposed to be discovered. And according to the timeline documented within those papers, it was already too late to stop what was coming. This is the story of Project Bluebeam, not the internet legend, not the wild speculation, the documented version, the one with names, dates, programs and technology that all check out when you start pulling the threads, the one that makes you wonder why we were ever allowed to know about it at all. Part 1. The file that shouldn't exist. Daniel Rousseau wasn't looking for a conspiracy when he inherited the box. He was a local news reporter for a small independent paper in Montreal, the kind of journalist who covered city council meetings and restaurant openings. At 38 years old, he'd long ago abandoned the idealistic dreams of investigative journalism that had driven him in his 20s. He paid his bills, wrote his assigned stories, and went home to his apartment overlooking Rue Saint-Denis. His Aunt Claire had passed away in late December, just after Christmas. She'd been his favourite relative growing up, a librarian with an endless curiosity about the world and a habit of collecting things. Books, mostly, but also letters, documents, photographs. Her apartment had been a museum of other people's lives, carefully catalogued and preserved. The estate lawyer had called Daniel on a cold January morning. Most of Claire's possessions were being donated or divided among other family members, but there was one item she'd specifically left to him in her will, a locked metal container that she'd been storing for a colleague who died 2 decades earlier. The will stipulated that the box was to be opened only by Daniel, and only after her death. Daniel picked up the box on a Tuesday afternoon. It was heavier than he expected, roughly the size of a small filing cabinet made of grey steel with a combination lock that had rusted at the edges. The lawyer handed him an envelope containing the combination written in his aunt's precise handwriting. He brought it home in the back of his car, struggling to carry it up 3 flights of stairs to his apartment. He set it on his kitchen table and stared at it for a long time before opening the envelope. The combination was simple, 4 numbers, each representing a year. He spun the dial carefully, feeling the mechanism click into place. When he lifted the lid, the smell of old paper and dust filled his small kitchen. Inside were documents, stacks of them. But these weren't the personal letters or family records he'd expected. These were official documents, NASA internal memos on official letterhead, photocopied budget reports with classification stamps, technical diagrams covered in handwritten notes, dates ranging from the beginning of the final decade of the Cold War through the middle of the 90s, and sitting on top of everything else, carefully wrapped in plastic, was a VHS tape in a faded case with a single label written in black marker. Bluebeam, Phase 3. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the tape. The plastic case was yellowed with age, the label faded but still legible. Underneath the title, someone had written a date in smaller script. June of the year before the bicentennial of American independence, 27 years ago. He set the tape aside and began removing the documents, spreading them across his kitchen table in careful piles. Manila folders, some stamped with official-looking headers, loose pages covered in technical jargon, photographs of equipment he didn't recognize, and throughout everything, names he did recognize. One folder caught his attention immediately. The tab read, SDI Star Wars, Atmospheric Projection Division, SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, Ronald Reagan's space-based missile defense program. That was real. That was documented history. Daniel had written a piece about the 40th anniversary of its announcement just a few years ago. But atmospheric projection, that wasn't in any of the public records he'd seen. That wasn't in any of the declassified documents about Star Wars. He opened the folder carefully. Inside were memos, technical specifications, and what appeared to be progress reports from various testing facilities. White Sands Missile Range, Kirtland Air Force Base, even a facility in Alaska he'd never heard of. Then he found the note. It was paper-clipped to a faded photocopy of what looked like a satellite trajectory chart. The paper was lined, torn from a notebook, covered in the same handwriting as the tape label. If this reaches you, Phase 1 has already begun. They've spent 30 years perfecting the technology, another 20, integrating it into the infrastructure. By the time you read this, the sky itself will be a weapon, and nobody will know the difference between what's real and what's projected. I tried to warn them. They made sure nobody listened. Don't make the same mistake. Document everything, verify everything, and understand that exposure doesn't stop this. It only confirms that the program has moved beyond the point where exposure matters. SM. The initials at the bottom made Daniel's stomach tighten. SM. He pulled out his laptop and searched for the name he suspected. Within seconds he had confirmation. Serge Monast, investigative journalist, born in Quebec, died in his Montreal apartment in December of the year the Olympic Games came to Atlanta. Cause of death, heart attack. Age, 46. No autopsy was performed at the request of his family, but that wasn't what made Daniel's hands shake as he read the Wikipedia entry. It was what Monast had been investigating before his death. In the mid-90s, Monast had published a series of explosive claims about a NASA-led psychological operation designed to establish a new world order through the use of advanced holographic technology. He called it Project Bluebeam. He claimed it had 4 phases: the breakdown of archaeological knowledge, a global show of holograms to simulate religious events, telepathic electronic two-way communication, and universal supernatural manifestations using electronic means. The claims were dismissed immediately. Labelled paranoid, conspiracy theorist drivel, Monas was mocked in the press, his credibility destroyed. Some articles suggested he'd had a mental breakdown. Others implied he was a grifter trying to sell books. Then he died. Suddenly. Unexpectedly. At 46 years old. And his research had ended up in Claire's storage locker, locked away for 20 years, waiting for someone to open it. Daniel looked at the documents spread across his table, the official letterhead, the classification stamps, the technical diagrams. This wasn't the work of a madman. This was evidence of something real. He made a pot of coffee. He called in sick to work. He turned off his phone, and he started reading. The first memo was dated July of the year the Berlin Wall still stood. It was addressed to someone whose name had been redacted, from someone else whose name had also been blacked out. But the subject line was clear. Feasibility assessment. Large-scale atmospheric visual projection for strategic deception operations. The memo was dense with technical language, but the core concept was simple. Using lasers, satellite arrays, and atmospheric manipulation to create visual phenomena in the sky that could be seen by large populations. The applications listed were all defensive, creating false missile trails to confuse enemy tracking systems, generating decoy aircraft to waste enemy ammunition, projecting images of military assets in locations where none existed. But buried in the third paragraph was a line that made Daniel stop. Secondary applications in domestic psychological operations remain theoretical, but promising. Initial simulations suggest population response to unexplained aerial phenomena follows predictable patterns that could be leveraged for narrative control and social conditioning. Daniel read it 3 times. Narrative control, social conditioning. Those weren't military terms. Those were intelligence terms, psychological operations terms. He kept reading. The next document was a budget allocation from the year the Challenger exploded. It showed funding for something called the Theoretical Event Projection Unit within NASA. The budget was modest, only a few million, but it was designated for advanced research in atmospheric manipulation and large-scale visual stimulation technologies. Then came a technical report from White Sands Missile Range, dated June of that same year. The report detailed a successful test of ground-based coherent light projection, creating a visual image in the sky that was visible from 15 miles away. The image had lasted for approximately 3 minutes before dispersing. Witnesses from nearby towns had reported seeing strange lights, but no official explanation had been provided. The report concluded with a recommendation. Technology shows significant promise for operational deployment. Recommend expanded testing with larger arrays and longer duration trials. Suggest coordination with ionospheric research programs for enhanced atmospheric effects. Ionospheric research programs. Daniel knew what that meant. He'd covered a story years ago about conspiracy theories surrounding HAARP, the high-frequency active auroral research program in Alaska. The official story was that HAARP studied the ionosphere for radio communications and surveillance purposes. The conspiracy theories claimed it was being used for weather control and mine manipulation. He pulled out his phone and searched for HAARP's founding date. Construction began in the early 90s. The facility became operational in the year Nirvana's lead singer died. The timing matched. Daniel found another document, this one from the year the Soviet Union dissolved. It was a memo discussing the involvement of outside consultants in the atmospheric projection research. 2 names were listed, Arthur C. Clarke, Richard Garwin. Daniel's heart rate increased. Those weren't random names. Those were giants in their fields. Arthur C. Clarke was one of the most famous science fiction authors of the 20th century, but he was also a legitimate scientist who'd predicted satellite communications decades before they became reality. He'd consulted with NASA and various government agencies throughout his career. Richard Garwin was a physicist who'd worked on the Manhattan Project and had been instrumental in developing laser weapons research for the military. He was one of the most respected scientists in defense circles. If these men had been involved, this wasn't some fringe pseudoscience project. This was serious research backed by serious people. Daniel kept digging through the files. He found technical specifications for satellite arrays capable of creating coordinated light patterns across multiple continents. He found psychological assessment reports analysing how different populations reacted to unexplained phenomena. He found test schedules and location coordinates and expected outcomes. And then he found the video log. It was a photocopy of a handwritten list, dated June of the year before the bicentennial. The heading read, Phase 3, Visual Documentation. Below it were timestamps and brief descriptions. 100 Owines, 02.30, Introduction and Program Overview. 10.30, 08:15, White Sands Projection Test Footage, June. 15, 12:45, Alaska Ionospheric Trial, August. Twistlamp of Flight Fide, 18:30, Coordinated Multi-Site Demonstration, October. 18:30, 24, Se. Phase 4, Preliminary Concepts and Deployment Scenarios. Daniel looked at the VHS tape sitting on his counter. 24 minutes of footage, evidence of tests that were never publicly acknowledged. Proof that the technology Monest had warned about wasn't theoretical, it was real. It had been real for 30 years. He needed a VHS player. Those were hard to find in the modern age, but Daniel knew a local electronics shop that specialised in vintage equipment. He grabbed the tape in his jacket and headed out into the winter cold. The streets of Montreal were quiet, snow falling in soft flakes that melted on the sidewalk. Daniel walked quickly, his mind racing. If everything in these documents was real, if the test had actually happened, then what else had Monest been right about? The electronics shop was run by an older man named Bernard, who specialised in converting old media to digital formats. Daniel had interviewed him once for a piece about obsolete technology. "I need this digitised," Daniel said, placing the tape on the counter. "How fast can you do it?" Bernard picked up the tape, examining it carefully. VHS in decent condition. Shouldn't take more than an hour. You want it on a thumb drive? Please. And Bernard, this is important. Can you make sure nobody else sees this? Nobody makes a copy. Bernard raised an eyebrow but nodded. "I'll do it myself. Go get coffee. Come back in an hour." Daniel spent the next 60 minutes in a nearby cafe, staring at his laptop screen without really seeing it. His hands shook slightly every time he reached for his coffee cup. He kept thinking about Monest, about a 46-year-old man dying suddenly, just weeks after publishing his findings. About research that disappeared into storage for 2 decades. When he returned to the shop, Bernard handed him a thumb drive without comment. "Interesting footage," was all he said. Daniel thanked him and left quickly. He went straight home, locked his door, closed his blinds and plugged the drive into his laptop. The video began with static, then cleared to show a simple title card. Project Blue Beam, Phase 3 Documentation, Restricted Access. Then the static again, and then footage. The first segment showed what appeared to be a desert testing facility at night. White Sands, according to the timestamp. The camera was positioned on some kind of elevated platform pointing at the sky. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a point of light appeared in the darkness. It grew, expanded, took shape. Within 30 seconds there was a clearly defined object in the sky, glowing with a blue-white light. It looked like a classic flying saucer, complete with a domed top and rotating lights around its perimeter. It wasn't real. Daniel could see the slight shimmer in the air around it, the way the edges weren't quite solid. But from a distance, to an untrained observer, it would have been convincing. Very convincing. The object hovered for approximately 2 minutes, then slowly faded away. The next segment showed similar tests, each one more sophisticated than the last. lights forming complex geometric patterns, shapes that appeared and disappeared. At one point, what looked like an enormous angel with spreading wings filled the frame, hovering over what the timestamp indicated was a test facility in Alaska. Daniel watched the entire 24 minutes without pausing. When it ended, he sat in silence for a long time. This was real. The technology existed. The tests had happened. Monast had been telling the truth. But if this was Phase 3, documented 27 years ago, what phase were they on now? And more importantly, why had this evidence survived at all? Why had it been allowed to sit in a storage locker for 2 decades, waiting to be found? Daniel looked at the final note Monast had left in the box. Exposure doesn't stop this. It only confirms that the program has moved beyond the point where exposure matters. He understood now. This wasn't a warning. This was a confirmation. If someone was finding this evidence, it meant the program was already complete. It meant whatever Bluebeam was designed to do, it was ready to happen. Or maybe it was already happening. Daniel opened a new document on his laptop and started typing. He was going to verify everything, every name, every date, every program. If this was real, the evidence would be in the public record, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to connect the dots. He typed until dawn, the winter sun rising over Montreal, casting long shadows across his kitchen table, covered in documents that shouldn't exist. Evidence of a conspiracy that had been dismissed as paranoid fantasy. Proof that sometimes the paranoid fantasies are just early warnings of truths too uncomfortable to acknowledge. Part 2. The foundation is real. The first thing Daniel did was verify everything he could. If this was a hoax, it would fall apart quickly. Conspiracy theories always do when you check the dates and names against historical records. The real world doesn't cooperate with elaborate fictions. Details don't match up. Timelines contradict each other. People who supposedly work together turn out to have never met. But these documents didn't fall apart. The more Daniel checked, the more solid they became. The timeline in Monast's files began in the summer of the year Psycho premiered in theatres, when NASA was officially founded as a civilian space agency. Daniel pulled up the National Aeronautics and Space Act, signed into law that July, creating NASA from the remnants of earlier military and civilian programs. On the surface, the whole operation was about beating the Soviets to the moon, about winning the space race, about demonstrating American technological superiority. But the memos in Daniel's possession suggested that from the very beginning, a subset of NASA engineers were tasked with something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with rockets or satellites or space exploration in the traditional sense. One memo, dated October of the year the Outer Space Treaty was signed, referenced a meeting between NASA officials and military intelligence officers about the potential use of high-orbit satellites for what the document called visual disruption and mass perception alteration. The meeting took place only months after the treaty banning weapons in space went into effect. The irony wasn't lost on Daniel. They were discussing how to weaponize space while signing treaties promising not to. The language in the memo was careful, clinical, full of the kind of bureaucratic, passive voice that makes atrocities sound like paperwork, but the intent was clear. Preliminary assessments indicate that space-based optical systems, when coordinated with ground-based projection arrays, could generate atmospheric phenomena visible to large population centres. Applications include strategic deception, enemy resource diversion, and domestic population response modelling. Domestic population response modelling. Daniel had been a journalist long enough to know what that meant. It meant figuring out how to manipulate civilian populations. It meant psychological operations aimed at American citizens. He cross-referenced the memo's date with public NASA activities from that period. October of the year the treaty was signed, NASA was publicly focused on the Apollo program. The first manned mission to orbit the moon was still a year away. The agency was consumed with beating the Soviets, with proving that America could dominate space. But apparently some engineers were thinking about something else, about how the sky itself could become a tool. Daniel kept reading through the chronology. The next major document was dated the year Ronald Reagan was shot. That was when the president announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a program to develop space-based defense systems capable of intercepting ballistic missiles. The public knew it as Star Wars, and most of the debate focused on whether laser weapons could actually shoot down Soviet nukes, whether the technology was feasible, whether it violated the various arms control treaties. But buried in the SDI documentation Daniel found in Monist files was a research branch that had received almost no public attention: advanced atmospheric manipulation and projection systems. The budget documents Daniel found showed funding for something called the Atmospheric Projection Division within SDI. The initial allocation was modest, barely $3 million in the first year, but it grew steadily. By the time the year Challenger exploded rolled around, the division was receiving over $20 million annually. The justification in the budget documents was always defensive. The official line was that the technology would create decoy targets in the sky to confuse enemy missile guidance systems. If Soviet missiles couldn't tell the difference between a real American city and a projected image of one, they might waste their warheads on empty desert. It was plausible. It fit within the strategic thinking of the time. But as Daniel read deeper into the technical reports, he saw the truth hidden in the language. The same technology that could create a decoy city could create anything. A false army, a fake disaster, an alien spacecraft, a religious vision, anything at all, projected into the sky for millions to see. A memo from June of the year Challenger exploded, signed by Lieutenant General James Abrahamson, the actual director of the SDI program, detailed significant progress. Ground-based coherent light projection systems have exceeded initial performance expectations. Recent trials at White Sands Missile Range demonstrated sustained visual phenomena at ranges exceeding 20 kilometers. Image stability has improved markedly with the integration of atmospheric sensing equipment. Visual fidelity is sufficient to create convincing representations of aircraft, missiles, and other objects of interest. Recommend expansion of testing program to include larger arrays and coordination with upper atmospheric research initiatives. Daniel pulled up everything he could find on Lieutenant General James Abrahamson. The man was real. He'd run SDI from its inception through the late 80s. He'd been a 3-star general in the Air Force, an astronaut candidate, a respected figure in defense circles. After leaving military service, he'd worked in private aerospace companies. If Abrahamson had signed off on atmospheric projection research, it wasn't fringe science. It was serious military development. White Sands Missile Range. Daniel knew the location. It was a massive military testing facility in New Mexico, spanning thousands of square miles of desert. It had been used for weapons testing since before NASA existed. The first atomic bomb had been detonated there. Missiles were tested there constantly. It was one of the most secretive military facilities in the country. Daniel searched for any public mention of atmospheric projection tests at White Sands in June of the year Challenger exploded. He found nothing. No news reports, no official acknowledgement, not even a mention in the base's publicly available testing schedules. But that wasn't unusual. White Sands conducted classified trials all the time. The absence of public records didn't mean the tests hadn't happened, it just meant they were secret. He kept reading through Monast's files following the chronology. By the time the Berlin Wall fell, SDI was being scaled back publicly. The Soviet threat was collapsing. The justification for Star Wars was disappearing along with the Soviet Union itself. Congress started cutting funding. Public interest waned. The program that had defined Reagan's defense policy was quietly being dismantled. But the atmospheric projection research didn't stop. If anything, the memo suggested it intensified. A document from early in the year the Soviet Union dissolved mentioned successful tests of large-scale aerial holographic projection and included a reference to outside consultants. The document specifically named Arthur C. Clarke and recommended his continued involvement in the theoretical development of the technology. Daniel researched Clarke extensively. The man wasn't just a science fiction author, he was a visionary who'd predicted satellite communications in a technical paper written in the year World War II ended, decades before the first satellites were launched. He'd worked with NASA as a consultant. He'd been respected by military planners and scientists across the world, and according to these documents, he'd been helping develop technology to create mass hallucinations in the sky. Another name appeared frequently in the later memos, Richard Garwin. Daniel found extensive documentation on him as well. Garwin was a physicist who'd worked on the hydrogen bomb. He'd been instrumental in developing laser technology for military applications. He'd consulted on missile defense, nuclear weapons policy, and classified programs most people had never heard of. The memo discussing Garwin's involvement was specific. Consultation with physicist Richard Garwin regarding feasibility of large-scale atmospheric refraction and ionospheric heating to create visual phenomena. Garwin's preliminary assessment suggests that focused electromagnetic radiation at specific frequencies could induce visible effects in the upper atmosphere. Recommends coordination with high-frequency active auroral research program in Alaska for practical trials. Ionospheric heating, upper atmosphere, Alaska, HAARP. Daniel knew about HAARP. Every conspiracy theorist knew about HAARP. The high-frequency active auroral research program had been a favourite target of speculation for decades. The official story was simple. It was a research facility designed to study the ionosphere for communications and surveillance purposes. The facility used high-powered radio transmitters to heat small portions of the ionosphere and measure the effects. But conspiracy theorists had claimed for years that HAARP was really about weather control, mind manipulation, earthquake generation, and a dozen other nefarious purposes. The theories had been dismissed as nonsense by mainstream media and scientists. But here in Monast's documents was proof that HAARP was in fact connected to Bluebeam, that the ionospheric research being conducted in Alaska was being coordinated with atmospheric projection technology. Daniel pulled up the official timeline for HAARP. Construction began in the early 90s. The facility became fully operational in the year the Unabomber was captured. The stated purpose never changed: ionospheric research for communications and surveillance. But according to these memos, there was another purpose: using the ionosphere itself as a projection screen. Daniel found a technical document that explained the concept. The ionosphere, the upper layer of Earth's atmosphere, could be manipulated by powerful radio transmissions. When heated in specific ways, it would glow, creating visible light. By coordinating multiple transmission sources, patterns could be created. Images, shapes, objects that would appear to be floating in the sky but were actually just excited particles in the upper atmosphere. It was brilliant and terrifying. Because if you could make the ionosphere glow in controlled patterns, you could create almost anything. With enough coordination and enough power, you could fill the sky with images visible across entire continents. Then Daniel found the memo that made his hands shake. It was dated March of the year Kurt Cobain died. The author's name had been redacted, but the subject line was clear: Civilian Response Trial, Phoenix Metropolitan Area. The memo was brief. Per previous authorization, large-scale atmospheric projection trial scheduled for March of next year. Location: Phoenix, Arizona. Population approximately 2 million. Expected weather conditions: clear skies, minimal cloud cover. Projection array: coordinated ground-based and satellite systems. Target visual: large triangular formation moving at subsonic speeds. Expected result: mass sighting event with multiple independent witnesses and media coverage. Objective: assess civilian response patterns. media amplification factors, and official explanation acceptance rates. Daniel stopped breathing for a moment. Phoenix, March of the year after this memo. He knew exactly what that meant. He opened a new browser window and searched. Phoenix lights. The results filled his screen. March of the year the Hale-Bopp comet was visible, specifically the 13th day of that month. Thousands of people across Arizona reported seeing a massive V-shaped object in the sky, silent and enormous, drifting slowly over the city. The object was described as being massive, possibly larger than any aircraft ever built. Witnesses included pilots, police officers, government officials. Hundreds of videos were taken. The governor of Arizona initially mocked the incident, then years later admitted he'd seen it too and couldn't explain it. It became one of the most famous mass UFO sightings in history. Books were written about it. Television shows investigated it. Researchers spent decades trying to understand what thousands of people had seen that night. The military's explanation was flares. They claimed it was illumination flares dropped during a training exercise at the Barry Goldwater Range southwest of Phoenix. But according to the memo in front of Daniel, it had been scheduled 3 years in advance. It had been a test, a trial run of mass projection technology, an experiment to see how a population would react to an unexplained phenomenon in the sky. And it had worked perfectly. People had seen what they'd been shown. They'd reacted predictably. The media had covered it extensively. And the official explanation, however implausible, had been accepted by most people. The memo even had a follow-up assessment, dated 2 months after the Phoenix event. Phoenix trial exceeded expectations. Media coverage sustained for over 72 hours. Official explanation accepted by approximately 60% of population, despite significant logical inconsistencies, remaining 40% divided between extraterrestrial hypothesis and general skepticism. No witnesses connected phenomenon to projection technology. Recommend expanded trials in international locations with varied cultural backgrounds. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling of his apartment. This changed everything. The Phoenix lights weren't a UFO sighting. They weren't flares. They were a psychological operation, a test of technology that could make thousands of people see something that wasn't there. And if they could do that in the late 90s, what could they do now, 25 years later, with advances in computer technology, satellite systems, and understanding of human psychology? He kept digging through the documents, creating spreadsheets, building timelines, verifying every name and date he could. The pattern was undeniable. Every piece fit, every name checked out, every program was real. This wasn't a conspiracy theory. This was a conspiracy fact. And according to Monast's final note, the program had been ready to go operational before the journalist died. That was more than 20 years ago. If it was ready then, what had they been doing in the decades since? Daniel needed to find people who'd been involved. People who could confirm these documents were real. People who could tell him what had happened to the program after Monast died. He started making a list of people to contact. Former NASA engineers, retired military personnel, anyone who might have worked on SDI or atmospheric research programs in the 80s and 90s. It was time to find out just how deep this went. Part 3. The People Who Knew. Finding Jacques Letourneau took Daniel 3 days of research and phone calls. The man had worked with Serge Monast in the early 90s, co-authoring several investigative pieces about government surveillance and the erosion of privacy rights. After Monast's death, Letourneau had largely disappeared from journalism, retiring to a small town outside Quebec City. Daniel finally tracked him down through an old journalism directory and a series of increasingly specific Google searches. When he called the number he'd found, an older man answered on the 4th ring. "Jacques Letourneau?" Daniel asked in French. There was a long pause. "Who's asking?" "My name is Daniel Rousseau. I'm a reporter in Montreal. I recently inherited some materials that belong to Serge Monast. I was hoping we could talk about them." The silence on the other end lasted so long Daniel thought the man had hung up. Then, I wondered when someone would finally open that box. They arranged to meet at a diner off the highway between Montreal and Quebec City. Neutral ground, public enough to be safe, quiet enough to talk. Daniel arrived early, ordering coffee and taking a booth near the back with a clear view of the entrance. The diner was the kind of place that probably hadn't changed its decor since the 80s. Worn vinyl seats, formica tables, menus printed on laminated paper. A handful of truckers sat at the counter drinking coffee and eating eggs. Le Tourneau arrived exactly on time. Daniel recognised him from an old photo he'd found online, though the man had aged considerably. He was in his 70s now, thin and grey, with the cautious eyes of someone who'd spent a lifetime asking dangerous questions and learning to be careful about the answers. He slid into the booth across from Daniel without offering his hand. "You have the files," he said. It wasn't a question. "I do. Did you know my aunt was storing them?" "Claire Rousseau. Yes, I knew. Serge gave them to her a week before he died. Told her someone would come asking eventually." Le Tourneau ordered coffee from a waitress who looked like she'd been working there since the restaurant opened. "You've read them?" "Most of them, and I watched the tape." Le Tourneau's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. "Then you know what he found." "I know what the documents say. I want to know if it's real." The old journalist stirred sugar into his coffee with deliberate slowness, his eyes scanning the diner. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Sergei wasn't crazy. I know that's what everyone thought. The media painted him as paranoid, delusional, a conspiracy theorist who'd lost his grip on reality. But I worked with him for years. I knew him, and I knew when he found something real. What did he find? Access. That's what it came down to. In the early 90s, Serge was working on a piece about satellite communication security. He had a source at a telecommunications company that handled uplinks for various government agencies, including NASA. The source showed him scheduling data, transmission protocols, satellite coordinates, normal stuff for a technical investigation. Le Tourneau paused to sip his coffee, but Serge noticed patterns, specific satellite arrays activating at specific times, transmitting on frequencies that didn't match their official specifications. And when he cross-referenced those activation times with unexplained aerial phenomena reports, they matched perfectly. Phoenix? Daniel asked. Among others. Phoenix was the most famous, but there were dozens of smaller incidents. Lights over Norway, strange clouds over China, geometric patterns over Australia. Every time the satellite arrays had been active hours beforehand, warming up, calibrating. Serge realised what he was looking at. NASA wasn't just studying these phenomena, they were creating them. Why? Le Tourneau shrugged, but his eyes were hard. Control, testing, preparation. Serge believed they were perfecting the technology for something bigger. He found references in some internal documents to a program called Blue Beam. The details were sparse, but the implication was clear. They were going to stage something massive, something that would convince people that their entire understanding of reality needed to change. A fake alien invasion? That was one theory. Serge also thought they might stage religious events, apparitions of religious figures appearing in the sky. Depending on the region, different figures. Jesus in Christian countries, the Mahdi in Muslim regions, various others adapted to local beliefs. The goal would be to create a global spiritual crisis that could be managed, guided toward unified thinking, toward acceptance of global governance. Daniel felt cold despite the warm diner. Did he have proof? He had documents, some of what you have now. Memos, budget reports, technical specifications. But when he tried to publish, everything went wrong. His main source disappeared. His editor killed the story. And then the authorities started harassing him. What kind of harassment? His partner was arrested on false charges. Tax fraud, they claimed, though the evidence was fabricated. Serge's bank accounts were frozen pending an investigation that never materialised. His phone was tapped. His apartment was broken into, though nothing was stolen, just searched. They were sending a message. They wanted him to know he was being watched. And then he died. Letourneau nodded slowly. Heart attack. Sudden. Fatal. At 46 years old with no prior heart problems. I was one of the last people to talk to him. 2 days before he died, he called me. Said he'd secured the documents. Given them to someone he trusted to keep them safe. Said if anything happened to him, someone would find them eventually. Did you believe him? About Blue Beam? The old man was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup. At first, I thought he was paranoid, reading too much into coincidences, connecting dots that weren't really there. But after he died, I started looking into it myself, quietly, carefully. And you know what I found? What? Everything checked out. The programs were real. The technology existed. The test had happened. Every verifiable claim Serge made was accurate. It wasn't paranoia. It was investigative journalism. He'd found something true, and it got him killed. You think he was murdered? I think a 46-year-old man in good health doesn't just die of a heart attack weeks after publishing findings that embarrass powerful government agencies. I think technology exists to induce heart attacks remotely. I think Serge knew too much and wouldn't stop talking about it. Draw your own conclusions. Daniel pulled out his laptop and showed Letourneau some of the documents he'd scanned. The old journalist examined them carefully, his expression growing more troubled with each page. "These are the originals," he said finally. "I recognise some of them. Serge showed them to me before everything fell apart." He looked up at Daniel. "You need to be very careful with these. The people behind this program, they're still out there. They're still active. And if they think you're becoming a problem... I'm a local news reporter. I write about city council meetings. Who's going to pay attention to me?" That's what Serge thought, right up until they destroyed his life. Letourneau leaned across the table. "Listen to me. If you're going to pursue this, do it smart. Verify everything independently. Build redundancies. Make sure the information exists in multiple places. And understand that publishing might not stop anything. It might just confirm that you found something real." Mona said the same thing in his note. That exposure doesn't stop the program. Because by the time you find evidence, the program has already moved beyond the point where exposure matters. They're confident enough to let the evidence exist. That should tell you something. They talked for another hour. Letourneau provided names of other people who might be willing to talk. Former colleagues of Monast, researchers who'd looked into similar phenomena, people who'd worked in aerospace or defence and had seen things that didn't quite add up. When they finally parted, Letourneau grasped Daniel's arm at the door. "One more thing," he said quietly. "Serge died in December, right before Christmas. The same week his partner was arrested. The same week his bank accounts were frozen. They timed it deliberately. Maximum disruption during the holidays when everyone's distracted. If you start feeling pressure, if authorities suddenly take an interest in your taxes or your personal life, get somewhere public and stay there." Daniel drove back to Montreal with his hands tight on the steering wheel, Letourneau's warnings echoing in his mind. The next interview was harder to arrange. The retired NASA engineer wouldn't give his name and refused to meet in person. They settled on a phone call through an encrypted messaging app, with the engineer calling from what he claimed was a prepaid phone that couldn't be traced. "I can't tell you much," the man said when the call connected. His voice was distorted, either naturally or through some kind of filter. "But I can tell you the atmospheric projection division was real. It wasn't a big program, maybe 20 people at its peak. But the technology worked." "How well did it work?" "Well enough. We could create images in the sky using intersecting laser arrays and ionospheric manipulation. Nothing huge at first, nothing solid, but enough to make people look up and wonder. By the time I left the program in the year Lewinsky's scandal dominated the news, we could project convincing representations of aircraft, geometric shapes, even crude moving images. Range was limited to maybe 50 kilometers, but the fidelity was improving constantly. What was it for? Officially, decoys, missile defense, creating false targets to waste enemy resources. But we all knew it could be used for other things. Psychological operations, mass deception, making people see things that weren't there, making them question what was real. Why did you leave? The engineer was quiet for a moment. Because I realised where it was heading. We started getting requirements that didn't make sense for missile defence. Requests to develop systems that could create humanoid figures, religious symbols, things that looked organic rather than mechanical. That's when I knew this wasn't about defence anymore. It was about something else, something I didn't want to be part of. What happened to the programme after you left? I don't know for certain, but I kept track of funding through people I stayed in contact with. After SDI was officially ended, the atmospheric projection research went deep black. Classified above top secret. Budgets became impossible to track, but the money was still flowing. That tells you the program didn't stop, it just went invisible. Do you think it's still active? I think technology like that doesn't just disappear. I think it gets better. I think whatever they were developing in the 90s, they've perfected by now. And I think if they ever decide to use it at full scale... The engineer trailed off. What? Most people won't be able to tell the difference between what's real and what's projected. That's the whole point. That's what we were building toward. A system so sophisticated, so convincing, that consensus reality itself becomes negotiable. The call ended shortly after. Daniel sat in his apartment staring at his notes. The third interview came through an unexpected channel. Daniel had reached out to several retired Air Force personnel who'd been stationed at classified research facilities in the 90s. Most didn't respond. A few sent brief replies saying they couldn't help. But one, a former intelligence linguist who'd worked at Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico, agreed to communicate through encrypted messages. The linguist refused to provide even basic identifying information, using only a randomly generated username. But the details in the messages suggested genuine insider knowledge. I worked signals intelligence at Kirtland from the year the first Gulf War started, through the year the Monica Lewinsky story broke. My job was translating intercepted communications related to foreign military research programs. Specifically, we were tracking Soviet and Chinese attempts to develop atmospheric manipulation technologies similar to what we were working on. Daniel typed back. So other countries were developing this too? Absolutely. The Soviets had a program called Project Aurora that was focused on creating visual phenomena in the sky. The Chinese had something similar, but we were ahead. By the mid-90s we had functional systems. I saw the test footage. Not just static images, but moving objects. Things that looked like aircraft, but weren't there. Shapes that appeared solid, but were just light and excited particles. How convincing was it? Very. We would run tests and then intercept the local radio traffic. Phone calls from people reporting strange lights. They couldn't tell it was artificial. To them, it was just unexplained phenomena. We even had a few instances where local news picked up the stories. Of course, official explanations were always provided. Weather balloons, atmospheric conditions, military exercises, whatever would make people stop asking questions. What happened to the program after the Cold War ended? It evolved. That's the thing people don't understand. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the justification for these programs didn't disappear. It just changed. Instead of defending against external enemies, the focus shifted to domestic applications, managing perception, controlling narratives. The technology we developed for strategic deception in warfare became a tool for information warfare at home. You're saying they turned it on American citizens. I'm saying the capability exists. Whether it's been deployed at scale, I can't confirm, but I can tell you that by the time I left the service, there was extensive discussion about using these systems for what they called narrative reinforcement operations. creating visual phenomena that would support specific policy goals or diplomatic initiatives, like staging a crisis or staging a solution. Imagine if a major international problem was emerging, something that required unprecedented cooperation or changes to existing power structures. Now imagine if a visual phenomenon appeared in the sky, something that seemed to confirm the narrative being pushed by authorities, something that made people more willing to accept radical changes because they'd seen evidence with their own eyes. That's terrifying. That's the world we live in. The technology exists, the infrastructure is in place. The only question is whether anyone has the will to activate it at full scale. The messages continued over several days. The linguist provided technical details about the systems, described organizational structures, confirmed names and programs that appeared in Monaster's documents. Everything lined up. Every piece fit. Daniel compiled all of his interviews into a growing file, cross-referencing testimonies, verifying claims wherever possible. 3 different sources, none of whom knew each other, all confirming the same basic facts. The technology was real. The program had existed since at least the 80s. It had gone black in the 90s and continued developing. The capability to create mass visual phenomena existed and had been tested repeatedly. The only question was whether it had ever been deployed for real, whether any of the unexplained phenomena of the past 30 years had been genuine or manufactured. Daniel started building a timeline of incidents, not just famous cases like Phoenix, but any mass sighting, any unexplained aerial phenomenon, any event that had generated widespread witness reports and media coverage. The pattern that emerged was chilling. Part 4. The Incidents That Match. Daniel spent 2 weeks cross-referencing Monaster's files with documented unexplained phenomena. He created a massive spreadsheet with dates, locations, descriptions, and any correlation with the test schedules and satellite data in the documents. The pattern wasn't immediately obvious. These events were scattered across decades and continents. But when Daniel organised them chronologically and marked the ones that appeared in Monaster's files, a clear progression emerged. The earliest reference in the documents was from the year before the new millennium, Norway. Multiple reports of strange spiral lights in the sky appeared in local newspapers from northern regions. The official explanation at the time was aurora borealis with unusual configurations, but in Monaster's files was a test schedule marked Scandinavian Population Response Trials, December. The descriptions matched. Spiral formations in the sky, glowing with unusual colours, appearing and disappearing over several nights. The memos noted that the test had been successful, with high witness credibility and minimal scepticism from local populations. Then nothing major for several years, at least nothing in the files. But the year Princess Diana died brought the Phoenix lights, already documented extensively in Daniel's research. The memo had scheduled it 3 years in advance. The test had exceeded expectations. What Daniel found disturbing was the follow-up analysis in the files. Pages of data about media coverage, witness reliability assessments, official explanation acceptance rates. They'd studied every aspect of how the event had played out. They had learned from it, used it to refine their understanding of mass psychology. The next major incident in the files was from late in the first decade of the new millennium. December of the year Copenhagen hosted the climate summit, the Norway spiral. Daniel remembered this one clearly. It had been all over the news at the time. A massive blue and white spiral appeared in the sky over northern Norway, visible for hundreds of kilometres. The geometric perfection of it had been stunning. Videos showed a perfect spiral of blue light with a white glow at the centre, as if someone had drawn it in the sky with a compass. The official explanation came within hours, a failed Russian missile test from the White Sea. The trajectory had spiralled out of control, creating the visual effect. The Russian military eventually confirmed the explanation, but the geometry had been too perfect, the timing too precise, the duration too long. A missile failure would create debris, erratic motion, rapid dissipation. The Norway spiral had maintained its formation for nearly 10 minutes, and in Monist's files was a memo dated 2 weeks before the event. Arctic atmospheric trial scheduled for December. Coordinates: northern Norway, approximately 70 degrees latitude. Expected weather: clear, minimal light pollution. Test objective: large-scale geometric formation using coordinated satellite array and ground-based ionospheric stimulation. Secondary objective: assess effectiveness of rapid official explanation deployment. Cover story: Russian missile malfunction. The cover story had been prepared in advance. They'd coordinated with Russian authorities, or at least created a plausible scenario that Russia could confirm. The spiral wasn't a missile failure, it was a test, and the official explanation had worked exactly as designed. Daniel found witness accounts from the Norway spiral. Thousands of people had seen it, photographed it, filmed it, and most of them had accepted the missile explanation without question, even though the physics didn't quite make sense. That was the genius of it. Provide an official explanation quickly, even if it's not entirely logical, and most people will accept it rather than entertain more disturbing possibilities. The timeline continued. October of a year in the middle of the current decade. Shanghai, China. Thousands of people reported seeing what appeared to be a floating city in the clouds, a massive mirage of skyscrapers hovering above the real skyline. Videos went viral on social media. News stations covered it as a fascinating meteorological phenomenon. Meteorologists called it a fata morgana, a complex form of superior mirage that can make distant objects appear to float in the air. The explanation was technically plausible. Fata morganas are real optical phenomena caused by temperature inversions, but in Monist's files was a reference. East Asia Urban Projection Sample, October. Test parameters: dense urban environment, high population density, extensive social media penetration. Objective: assess viral information spread in digitally connected population. They tested how quickly an unexplained phenomenon would spread through social media. How many people would film it, share it, discuss it? They'd studied the patterns of information flow in the age of smartphones and instant communication. Daniel found dozens of smaller incidents: lights over military bases, geometric formations over remote areas, objects that appeared and disappeared. Every major unexplained sky event from the past 30 years had a corresponding entry in the files. Not all of them. Some incidents were probably genuine unexplained phenomena, but enough of them matched the test schedules to establish a pattern. They'd been testing for decades, refining the technology, learning how populations react, studying how information spreads, how official explanations are accepted or rejected, how media's coverage affects public perception. Each test built on the previous ones. Each incident taught them something new about mass psychology and information control. The most recent entry in Monist's files was from the year before he died, but Daniel knew the testing hadn't stopped when Monist discovered it. If anything, it had probably intensified. He started searching for unexplained phenomena from after Monist's death. The pattern continued. Norway had another spiral in the year the Panama Papers were released. There were strange lights over multiple US military bases in the year before the last presidential election. Geometric formations over South America. Massive glowing orbs over cities in Europe and Asia. Some of these had received media coverage. Others had been dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications. But the frequency was increasing. The sophistication was growing. Daniel created visualizations of the data, maps showing locations, timelines showing frequency, graphs showing the increasing complexity of the phenomena. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't random. This was systematic testing of technology designed to control what people saw in the sky. But testing for what? What was the ultimate goal? Daniel went back to Monast's note. They've spent 30 years perfecting the technology, another 20 integrating it into the infrastructure. If Monast had discovered this in the mid-90s, and the program had been running since the 60s, that was 30 years of development. Monast died more than 20 years ago. That was another 2 decades of refinement and integration. They weren't testing anymore, they were ready. The question was, ready for what? Part 5. After the towers fell. Daniel noticed something change in the document's timeline. After September of the year the towers fell, the nature of the program shifted fundamentally. He found this pattern not in Monast's files, which ended in the mid-90s, but in public records, budget documents, policy papers, congressional testimony, all publicly available, all hiding in plain sight. Between the year the towers fell and the middle of the following decade, there was an explosion in funding for psychological operations, electronic warfare, and something the documents called perception management. The Department of Defense budget showed billions allocated to programs with deliberately vague names: strategic communications, information dominance, cognitive security, narrative operations. Daniel pulled up the actual budget documents from those years. They were publicly available through the Freedom of Information Act, though heavily redacted. But even with the redactions, the numbers told a story. In the year before the towers fell, spending on psychological operations across all military branches totaled roughly 300 million. By the year the housing market began to collapse, that number had increased to over 4 billion. The budget line items were scattered across different agencies, different departments, different classification levels. But Daniel tracked them all, compiling a spreadsheet that showed the massive increase in spending on what essentially amounted to domestic information control. It wasn't just military spending. Intelligence agencies received similar increases. The Department of Homeland Security, created in the aftermath of the attacks, had entire divisions dedicated to countering disinformation and information security that were really about shaping public perception of threats and government responses. Then in the year the housing market collapsed, something interesting appeared in the Federal Register. A notice about the creation of something called the National Applications Office. Daniel had never heard of it, so he researched extensively. The NE was designed to coordinate the use of spy satellites for domestic purposes. The official justification was Homeland Security, disaster response, and border security. Intelligence agencies already had satellites watching the entire planet. Why not use that capability to help domestic agencies? The backlash was immediate. Privacy advocates raised alarms. Congressional committees expressed concerns. The media actually paid attention for once, running stories about Big Brother watching American citizens from space. The NAO was officially shut down before it even became operational. The announcement came within months of its creation. A victory for privacy, the headlines proclaimed. But Daniel found documents showing that while the NAO itself was disbanded, the infrastructure remained. The satellite coordination systems were transferred to other agencies. The legal frameworks were preserved under different names. The program hadn't been killed, it had just gone invisible. That was a pattern Daniel kept seeing. Programs would be announced, face public criticism, get officially ended, but the core capabilities would continue under different names in different agencies. Around the same time, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, began launching a series of projects that caught Daniel's attention. DARPA had always been at the cutting edge of military technology. They'd created the internet, GPS, stealth technology, and dozens of other innovations that eventually became civilian products. But in the years following the year the towers fell, their focus shifted towards something different. Brain-computer interfaces, neural manipulation, what they called neurotechnology for national security. Daniel found public documents about these programs. They weren't secret. DARPA published papers about their research. They held conferences. They recruited from universities. One program was called Silent Talk. The goal was to allow soldiers to communicate through thought alone, using neural interfaces that could detect and transmit brain signals. The potential military applications were obvious: silent communication in combat zones, coordination without radio chatter. But Daniel saw the other implications. If you could detect what someone was thinking and transmit it, you could also potentially send signals back. You could potentially influence thought itself. Another program was called Narrative Networks. The official description was about understanding how narratives and stories shape group behaviour and decision-making. The goal was to develop ways to counter extremist narratives and promote pro-social messaging. But the research went deeper than that. It explored how specific narratives could be crafted to influence large populations, how stories could be deployed strategically to shape public opinion, how psychological triggers could be identified and exploited. Then there was biological control. This program aimed to use electromagnetic stimulation to trigger specific biological responses in the brain. The official goal was treating PTSD and traumatic brain injuries in soldiers, but the underlying technology could theoretically be used to induce specific mental states in targeted individuals. Daniel compiled all of this research. He cross-referenced it with the atmospheric projection technology from Monist's files, and he started to see how everything connected. The holographic projection technology from the 80s and 90s could control what people saw. The neurotechnology research from the 2000s and beyond could influence what people thought and felt. The information control infrastructure established after the towers fell could manage how people interpreted what they saw and felt. Together, it was a complete system for managing human perception at scale. He found an article from the year before the last presidential election. A retired DARPA scientist had written an op-ed piece published in a small tech journal. The article was critical of what the scientist called weaponized psychology in government programs. Daniel tracked down the full piece. One paragraph jumped out. What began as defensive technology has become something else entirely. We told ourselves we were developing tools to counter foreign propaganda, to protect soldiers from psychological warfare, to help citizens distinguish truth from disinformation. But we've built something more powerful and more dangerous. We've created the ability to shape consensus reality itself, to make people see what we want them to see, believe what we want them to believe, feel what we want them to feel. And we've done it all in the name of national security. Daniel tried to contact the scientist. The email bounced back. The phone number was disconnected. A search for the scientist's name revealed that he'd died 2 years after publishing the article. Heart attack, age 63, another heart attack, another inconvenient death. Daniel kept digging. He found evidence of the infrastructure being integrated into civilian systems. Social media companies working with intelligence agencies to develop disinformation detection algorithms that could also be used to suppress information. Telecommunications companies installing hardware that allowed monitoring and potentially manipulation of communications. Smart city initiatives that created surveillance networks capable of tracking entire populations. None of it was hidden. It was all public information, just scattered across thousands of different sources, buried in technical documents and budget reports and policy papers that nobody read. The infrastructure for total information control had been built in plain sight. And then Daniel found the leaked email. It was posted on a fringe forum dedicated to tracking government surveillance programs. The poster claimed to have received it from a friend who worked in cybersecurity consulting for defense contractors. The email was allegedly from a retired DARPA scientist to a former colleague, dated the year after the pandemic began. Daniel verified what he could. The email header data suggested it was genuine, though it could have been forged. The scientist's name checked out. He'd worked on several neurotechnology programs in the 2000s, but confirming the content was impossible. The email was brief. I saw your piece in the Journal of Defense Technology. Good work documenting the network architecture, but you're still thinking too small. Project Bluebeam was never cancelled, it was upgraded. The holographic projection was only ever part of it. The real goal was always psychological, making people see what you want them to see, believe what you want them to believe. With modern technology, AI-generated content, deepfakes, voice, synthesis, ubiquitous surveillance, you don't even need the holograms anymore. You can create entire realities, custom-tailored to specific populations or even individuals. The infrastructure is in place. The capability exists. All that's missing is the activation order. Daniel read the email a dozen times. Then he started researching the current state of the technologies mentioned. Deepfakes had become nearly perfect. AI systems could generate video of anyone saying anything, with perfect lip sync and natural expressions. Voice synthesis could clone anyone's voice from a few minutes of audio samples. Image generation had reached the point where artificial images were indistinguishable from photographs. Social media algorithms could create completely different information environments for different users, showing them content calibrated to their existing beliefs and emotional triggers. Search engines could manipulate what information people found. Digital maps could show different routes to different people. Weather apps could display different forecasts. Reality itself had become customizable, not through holograms in the sky, but through the screens everyone carried in their pockets. The atmospheric projection technology wasn't obsolete. It was just one tool in a much larger toolkit. Daniel thought about the implications. If you could control what people saw on their screens and in the sky, if you could influence what they thought and felt through targeted content and electromagnetic stimulation, if you could manage what information they had access to and what explanations they would accept for unexplained events, you could shape reality itself, not physical reality, but consensus reality, the shared understanding of what's true, what's important, what's happening in the world, and whoever controlled that controlled everything. Daniel's research was interrupted by a notification on his phone, an alert from his banking app. His account had been flagged for suspicious activity and temporarily frozen pending investigation. He called the bank immediately. They couldn't provide details over the phone but asked him to come in to discuss the matter. They made an appointment for later that week. Daniel felt cold. He thought about Letourneau's warning, about what had happened to Monast. He backed up everything immediately, uploaded copies of all his research to multiple cloud services, sent encrypted copies to several journalist friends with instructions not to open them unless something happened to him, made physical backups on USB drives that he hid in different locations. He wasn't paranoid, he was being careful, because he was starting to understand that Monast had been right about all of it, and people who were right about this kind of thing tended to have unfortunate accidents. Part 6. The Hidden Division. Daniel filed his Freedom of Information Act request with NASA in March. He wasn't expecting much. FOA requests to government agencies typically returned either heavily redacted documents or outright denials based on national security exemptions. But he had to try. He requested any and all documents related to the Atmospheric Projection Division within the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Theoretical Event Projection Unit, any programs or research related to large-scale atmospheric visual phenomena, budget documents for any programs related to ionospheric manipulation for projection purposes. He also requested, somewhat optimistically, any documents related to coordination between NASA and DARPA on perception management or psychological operations. The response came 3 months later. A thick envelope containing mostly redacted documents, and a letter explaining that much of the